It begins with a paradox that history struggles to explain. The Habsburg dynasty, once called the empire where the sun never set, spread its rule across Europe and far beyond the Atlantic. From Vienna's marble halls to Madrid's golden palaces, from alpine fortresses to colonies lit by foreign skies, their presence seemed eternal, unshakable, almost destined. Yet today, they linger only in fragments, remembered for faded portraits, broken crowns, and an infamous deformity etched into their bloodline. How could something so vast dissolve into silence unless that silence itself was carefully arranged? The paradox grows sharper when we recall what sustained their power. Unlike other empires forged by conquest, the Habsburgs built dominion through marriages. Kingdom after kingdom was not conquered by the sword, but folded into their grasp through family bonds. It seemed a clever design. Yet beneath the official explanation lay another, whispered in cloisters and corridors, that their unions were not merely political but ritual. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces. Each generation repeated the same names, the same features, as though a mirror had been placed before the throne. Was this accident, or was it an obsession with guarding a bloodline believed to be sacred? The preservation of pure blood carried with it both power and ruin. From this practice came the fabled Habsburg jaw, a grotesque reminder carved into their flesh, marking heirs with deformity as if the very body resisted the plan. Why would rulers so capable in politics knowingly weaken their offspring unless the goal was not physical strength at all, but the preservation of something older, intangible, an essence of lineage they believed could not be diluted without losing divine favor? Could it be that they saw their blood not as mortal inheritance, but as a covenant binding them to a mystery stretching far deeper than politics, beneath the glow of coronations? The church raised its hand in blessing, yet every blessing was also a chain. The Vatican crowned them, sanctified their marriages, and in return, the dynasty became its most obedient servant. To many, this was an alliance of convenience, but in the echoing vaults of cathedrals, records hint at something darker. Pacts sealed in candlelit chambers, vows made not to people but to powers cloaked in scripture. How much of their empire belonged to the Habsburgs themselves, and how much was simply lent to them as custodians of an ancient design? Whispers spoke of relics once carried by the Templars, objects of devotion and power thought destroyed when the order was purged. Yet strange coincidences tied those relics to monasteries and abbeys under Habsburg patronage. The dynasty did not parade them publicly. They kept them hidden, folded into libraries and treasuries, locked behind stone. If such relics survived, entrusted to their care, what would it mean that the Templar flame did not vanish at all, but slipped into new guardianship under a family so interwoven with the Vatican that no one would dare suspect them? Even their title carries unsettling weight. The empire where the sun never sets was not just a boast of geography. Could it have been a coded acknowledgement? A reminder that their role extended beyond time zones and continents? Perhaps the sun symbolized something eternal, knowledge that must never fade, a flame kept alive even as thrones collapsed. The irony remains that their empire did fall, and yet the phrase survives, echoing as though the real legacy was never land or soldiers, but the invisible current of memory they guarded. Their decline, too, resists easy explanation. Other empires fell to war or rebellion, but the Habsburg unraveling felt both inevitable and curiously deliberate, as though when their purpose was fulfilled, the structure was allowed to crumble, leaving behind only ruins and whispers. And still the questions linger. Were they simply victims of their own excess, or chosen vessels for a mission stretching across centuries? Were their deformities punishments of nature, or seals of a pact too sacred to break? To stand in Vienna today beneath the dome of their palaces is to feel the silence pressing against the walls. It is the silence of things withheld, the silence of manuscripts never read, the silence of secrets passed from priest to emperor in words too dangerous to be written. It is a silence that asks us to wonder, what if the dynasty did not truly fade, but merely closed a door, leaving behind the illusion of an ending? The paradox remains. An empire that seemed eternal is gone. A bloodline that sought purity left behind deformity. A dynasty that claimed the world left only questions. And yet, the first door opens here into a corridor of shadows where answers are never complete, only concealed. A single marriage once altered the course of Europe. When Ferdinand of Aragon wed Isabella of Castile in the late 15th century, the unification of Spain was sealed. From that bond, the empire's golden age began. But this was no ordinary union of hearts or kingdoms. It set a precedent the Habsburgs would perfect, turning marriages into weapons sharper than any blade, tools capable of building realms without shedding blood. In candlelit chapels beneath frescoed ceilings heavy with incense, vows were spoken that seemed innocent, yet they bound continents together under one name. But what if those vows were more than political instruments? What if every exchange of rings and blessings concealed a deeper design, as though the church itself had ordained that bloodlines be interwoven for reasons never told? Consider the wedding of Maximilian I of Habsburg to Mary of Burgundy in 1477. On parchment, it was a dynastic triumph, granting the Habsburgs vast Burgundian lands and positioning them at the heart of European politics. Yet beyond treaties and dowries, whispers grew that this union marked the moment when unseen powers took notice. Suddenly, the family's ascent accelerated, as though invisible hands were clearing obstacles from their path. Could it be coincidence? Or was this the moment when the dynasty entered into something resembling a covenant? Their marriages no longer mere human arrangements, but rituals serving a hidden script. From that time forward, their strategy became unmistakable. Charles V, heir to both Spanish and Austrian crowns, embodied the result of calculated unions. His dominion stretched from Iberia to the New World, from Vienna to the Netherlands. The sun truly never set on his lands. And yet, when one examines his lineage, it reads less like a family tree and more like an echo chamber. Branches folding back into themselves, names repeated, faces repeated, until one wonders whether the blood carried something precious that could not be diluted. The Church sanctified these unions, but behind sanctity lay unease. Was the Vatican merely blessing political prudence, or was it safeguarding a lineage tied to mysteries reaching back to Jerusalem and beyond? Legends surrounding these marriages grew like ivy across stone. Tales whispered in Spanish monasteries claimed that Habsburg blood carried traces of something older than Europe itself, a thread from Davidic or even more ancient lines. Was this fantasy, or a carefully nurtured myth designed to cloak their political strategy in divine authority? Either way, it gave weight to their obsession with keeping the bloodline intact. Marriages to cousins and nieces were not mistakes. They were deliberate acts, repeated so often they became ritual, as though each ceremony renewed a vow whose origins were never spoken aloud. But every vow has its cost. In the faces of their children, one can see the paradox written in bone, the jaw that jutted forward, the teeth misaligned, the expressions frozen into almost grotesque masks. These deformities became the dynasty's curse. Yet they also served as proof of something undeniable. The bloodline was guarded fiercely to the point of fragility. Why would rulers who commanded half the world risk their future heirs for the sake of preserving a dangerous myth? Unless they believed that to dilute the blood was to extinguish something far greater than dynastic power, something they feared losing more than their thrones themselves. The ceremonies themselves carried layers of mystery. Beneath the solemn words spoken before altars, agreements were inked in shadows. Priests and cardinals witnessed not only vows of matrimony, but oaths of loyalty whispered between crowns and crow's ears. The Vatican's role was never passive. It was the silent architect, ensuring that each bond tightened the dynasty's allegiance to the Church. One wonders, were the Habsburgs marrying for love of power or for fear of breaking a covenant with the only institution older than their empire? Even more unsettling are the fragments of stories connecting these marriages to relics of the Templars. Some whispered that hidden dowries included not gold, but manuscripts, artifacts, knowledge preserved in secret after the order's suppression. A bride might carry jewels, yes, but what if she also carried documents sealed in wax, entrusted to her family centuries before? What if every marriage was also a transfer of fragments of a forbidden inheritance, disguised as a union of lands? As the dynasty expanded, the map of Europe seemed to bend around them. Borders shifted, crowns merged, and yet the Habsburgs remained central, as though the very geometry of power was recalculated in their favor. Could this be explained by diplomacy alone? Or does it suggest that an invisible hand ensured each marriage aligned with a hidden architecture of control, one that ordinary eyes could not perceive? Imagine the palaces of the time, their chapels lit by countless candles, choirs singing in Latin, while the bride and groom stood motionless, hands joined. To the common people, it was spectacle. To nobles, it was politics. But to those in the deepest vaults of power, was it something else entirely? A renewal of vows stretching back to vanished orders, to relics hidden beneath abbeys, to secrets guarded not by nations, but by faith itself. The paradox sharpens when we recall the cost. These marriages consolidated realms, but they also sowed the seeds of fragility. By the 17th century, heirs were few, their health frail, their line nearing collapse. Yet still, the dynasty did not abandon the pattern. To abandon it would have been to break the very principle that defined them. It was as though they would rather risk extinction than risk dilution. Why such devotion to a path that seemed to doom them, unless extinction itself was preferable to betrayal of a covenant too sacred to violate? The truth lies buried beneath centuries of ritual, but the pattern is undeniable. Each marriage was a doorway, each union a thread woven into a tapestry whose design we cannot fully see. Were these alliances truly about land and power, or were they the outer symbols of an inner mission, one handed down from vanished orders and sanctioned by the Vatican's hidden hand? The question lingers, unanswered, unsettling. And so the story does not end with crowns exchanged or kingdoms united. The marriages were only the surface, the visible performance. Beneath them, in silence, something else was being bound together, something we are only beginning to suspect, yet cannot fully name. The city of Vienna, wrapped in mist from the Danube, has always been more than a capital. To walk its narrow streets at night, when the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral echo against stone, is to sense that beneath the music and grandeur lies a silence filled with secrets. The Habsburgs made Vienna their beating heart. But the pulse of that heart often resided not in public halls, but in vaults carved deep beneath palaces and monasteries. What is preserved there, in shadows no tourist will ever see. Documents never copied, maps never published, contracts never broken. The true story of Europe may not be written on the walls of its universities, but hidden in the archives of its rulers, guarded like relics too dangerous to release. In the Hofburg Palace, visitors marvel at gilded chambers and Baroque ceilings, yet beneath those marble floors lie chambers rarely opened. Records whisper that treaties signed in Vienna were not merely between kings and states, but included silent partners cloaked in robes of the church, concealed beneath layers of music, feasts, and ceremony. Words were spoken in low tones that determined the fate of nations. It was in these hidden meetings that the Habsburgs forged bonds stronger than armies, agreements sealed not by weapons, but by oaths carried into vaults where the ink never fades. Why keep such agreements from the eyes of history, unless their contents revealed an arrangement that would shatter the illusion of power as we are taught to see it? The city's musical reputation also carries its irony. While the symphonies of Haydn and Mozart filled gilded theaters, the true music of power was silence, the muffled closing of a vault door, the whisper of keys turning in locks. Behind those locks, chronicles speak of maps where Europe's borders were drawn decades before wars confirmed them. If the Habsburgs already knew the outlines of the future, Who had given them this knowledge? Could it have been advisors from the Vatican, guardians of archives older than kingdoms, or emissaries carrying remnants of the Templar libraries, dispersed but never destroyed? There are stories, barely acknowledged, of tunnels stretching beneath Vienna, connecting abbeys, palaces, and cathedrals in a hidden network. Some led to wine cellars, but others to vaults where manuscripts have rested untouched for centuries. Monks whispered of books chained to altars, too dangerous to be read, containing diagrams of stars, instructions for rituals, genealogies, tracing bloodlines not only of kings but of something older, almost mythic. Were these simply medieval fantasies, or fragments of a knowledge deliberately locked away from the common world, entrusted only to a dynasty bound to secrecy through faith and blood? The paradox emerges again. The Habsburgs presented themselves as guardians of Catholic order, protectors of Christendom against Protestant heresy and Ottoman invasion. Yet within their own city, the silence of hidden vaults suggests they guarded something else as well. If their mission was only political, why maintain such secrecy? Why preserve manuscripts and ciphers, maps annotated with symbols unknown to scholars, relics cataloged but never shown, unless they were keepers not only of thrones but of memories erased from official history, fragments of civilizations deliberately forgotten? Could Vienna have been less a capital of empire and more a vault disguised as a city, its very streets forming the walls of a labyrinth meant to conceal? Historians point to the Congress of Vienna in 1815 when diplomats redrew Europe after Napoleon's defeat. But how many recall that these negotiations unfolded in a city already shaped by centuries of secret treaties? The official record shows agreements written in clear ink. But the true power lay in conversations that left no trace, words exchanged in cloisters where candles burned down to wax and no one else was permitted entry. The Congress was merely a continuation of a much older practice, Vienna as the stage for decisions that outlived generations. The city became not only a meeting place, but a vault of memory, carrying secrets too vast to be written. Legends persist of one vault in particular, sealed beneath a monastery near the Danube, said to contain a collection of scrolls rescued from the fall of Constantinople. Among them were described texts that spoke of a kingdom before kingdoms, a lineage that survived the flood, and fragments of forbidden knowledge carried through time. If such relics truly exist, the Habsburgs may not have been their owners, but their custodians, chosen precisely because their bloodline was bound to obedience by both tradition and the Vatican. Was it by chance that the dynasty grew powerful enough to protect such secrets? Or was their empire constructed deliberately to serve as the shield around them? In Vienna's State Hall today, tourists walk beneath frescoes of heavenly allegories, unaware that some shelves remain locked, their volumes accessible only to those granted authority by the Church. Scholars suspect that behind those cabinets lie manuscripts never cataloged, their pages blackened by age, their words encrypted in codes inherited from the Jesuits. If these books were ordinary, why hide them? Why keep them sealed away while the world outside sings of Vienna's music and grandeur? Could it be that the city's beauty was itself a mask, a distraction concealing a deeper purpose as a repository for knowledge that could fracture the story of Europe if ever revealed? One cannot ignore the strange symmetry of it all. As music soared and balls glittered, as horse-drawn carriages clattered through narrow streets, the Habsburgs built layers of silence beneath the sound. The louder the music, the deeper the silence it concealed. And within that silence, one suspects, lies the true story of their empire, not the visible grandeur, but the invisible guardianship of secrets erased elsewhere. What if the Habsburgs were less rulers than wardens, less sovereigns than keepers of memory, too dangerous for daylight? What if Vienna was never merely a capital, but a vast vault whose keys were passed quietly from hand to hand, generation after generation? The thought lingers, heavy as the stone arches above the hidden chambers, and it asks us to consider what lies still sealed beneath our feet, waiting for a hand brave enough or reckless enough to open it. In Rome, the Vatican towers above the city like a citadel of eternity. Yet its influence stretches far beyond marble colonnades and frescoed ceilings. To understand the Habsburgs, one must understand that their crowns did not rest solely upon their own heads. They were placed there by hands anointed with oil, like hands that claimed authority from God himself. The dynasty may have worn the regalia of emperors and kings, but their legitimacy was forged in papal chambers, sealed by blessings that seemed divine, yet carried the weight of political obligation. Was this sanctity freely granted, or was it a pact that bound the dynasty to serve as the Church's most obedient instrument? The Vatican's invisible hand shaped every ascent. When Maximilian I sought legitimacy as Holy Roman Emperor, papal approval transformed his claim into reality. When Charles V inherited crowns across Spain and Austria, the Church sanctified his dominion, presenting it not as fortune, but as divine destiny. Yet behind the rituals of coronation lay something more binding than pomp. The papacy did not merely bless, it extracted oaths, forged treaties, whispered commands. In the silence of marble halls, the Vatican acted less as witness and more as architect. Could it be that the Habsburgs were never fully sovereign, but custodians entrusted with power only so long as they remained faithful to a script written in shadow? The paradox deepens when one considers the nature of these blessings. A papal crown granted legitimacy, but it also placed invisible chains upon the wearer. Once an emperor knelt before the Pope, he could never again claim his authority as entirely his own. Every law, every war, every marriage carried the unspoken question: was it the will of the crown or the will of the altar? The Vatican's hand was light enough to be ignored in ceremony, but heavy enough to press upon every decision. Why did the Habsburgs, who commanded armies and lands beyond measure, so consistently to this invisible authority, unless the power they guarded was not of this world, and only the Church could ensure its survival? Persistent though unproven are the stories that papal legates carried more than blessings into Vienna. They carried sealed scrolls, ciphers, and relics entrusted only to emperors bound by blood and oath. Some say these were fragments of the Templar archives smuggled from France after the order's suppression. Others claim they were manuscripts recovered from fallen Constantinople, knowledge once thought lost to the East. Why entrust such treasures to secular rulers unless those rulers were never truly secular, but chosen guardians bound by covenant? If so, then the Vatican's hand extended far deeper than politics. It shaped the dynasty into a vessel, ensuring that dangerous knowledge remained under ecclesiastical control without ever appearing so. In return, the Habsburgs reaped immense benefit. Their empire expanded. Their marriages united continents. Their enemies often found themselves excommunicated, isolated, or crushed. Papal authority buttressed their claims at every step. Yet this favor came at a price. Whenever the Vatican demanded obedience, the dynasty complied. When Protestant winds swept across Europe, the Habsburgs became the Church's sword, waging wars that consumed nations for decades. They defended altars with blood, not only out of devotion, but because their very legitimacy depended on it. Could it be that the wars we remember as religious conflicts were also the visible shadows of hidden agreements, obligations sealed centuries before? Even their titles revealed the depth of Vatican influence. The Holy Roman Emperor was styled as the defender of Christendom, chosen to uphold the faith against heresy and infidel alike. But such titles were not merely honorific. They were obligations disguised as grandeur. Behind each coronation lay a whisper: your throne exists because we allow it, and it will be taken if you falter. In this sense, the Vatican was less partner than puppeteer, its strings invisible yet impossible to sever. And still, if the dynasty were only a puppet, how did it endure so long, holding together lands so vast? Perhaps because the strings themselves were made of belief, and belief is stronger than any chain of iron. What remains disturbing is how often papal involvement coincided with the turning points of Habsburg history. When the Spanish Inquisition expanded, it did so under Habsburg rule, sanctioned by Rome. When vast territories were divided, papal bulls legitimized the division, binding not only kings but entire nations to obedience. When the dynasty seemed threatened, papal diplomacy shielded them from collapse. Again and again, the Vatican's hand appears not at the margins, but at the center, guiding outcomes as though reading from a script no one else was allowed to see. Were the Habsburgs architects of their destiny, or merely actors performing roles assigned long before? Some suggest that the Vatican saw in the Habsburgs what it had once seen in the Templars, loyal guardians capable of wielding both sword and secrecy. The Templars had been destroyed for growing too powerful, their knowledge scattered and suppressed. Would you like me to continue this in the same style, carrying the thread into how the Vatican may have used the Habsburgs as a safer replacement for the Templars? But the Church still required custodians, guardians who could safeguard what was too dangerous to reveal. The Habsburgs, bound by bloodline and obedience, became the natural inheritors. This would explain their unusual rise, their uncanny ability to survive crises, their persistence even in decline. If so, then their empire was less an accident of marriage and war, and more a structure deliberately built to shield what the Church could not expose. To stand today in St. Peter's Basilica is to feel the weight of centuries pressing down in silence. The marble glitters, the mosaics blaze, but beneath the surface lies a continuity that cannot be seen. The Habsburgs knelt here, their crowns resting on altars, their futures decided by words whispered in Latin. We remember their empire as political, but in truth, their story is inseparable from the Vatican's shadow. Could it be that the dynasty's true role was never to rule Europe, but to guard the Church's most dangerous secrets? And if so, what became of those secrets when the crowns fell and the vaults closed? The invisible hand remains, its fingerprints scattered across centuries, its presence undeniable yet unspoken. The Vatican crowned, blessed, and guided, but it also concealed, orchestrating a dynasty's rise not merely for glory, but for guardianship. The question lingers unanswered. Was the Habsburg legacy one of empire or of servitude to a hidden covenant? The silence of the Vatican's vaults offers no reply, only the echo of chains that still seem to rattle in the shadows of memory. The Templars were said to have vanished in fire and confession, their order dissolved by papal decree, their leaders burned in Paris at dawn. Officially, their memory was erased, their power scattered like ashes in the wind. Yet, history has a way of disguising survival as extinction. For in the centuries that followed, shadows of their presence appeared where the Habsburgs rose to prominence, as though the knights had never truly vanished, but merely changed their garments, slipping into a new court, hidden beneath the veil of dynastic grandeur. Could the dynasty that ruled Europe also have been the custodian of a legacy deemed too dangerous to leave unguarded? The connection is whispered in fragments. Legends speak of treasures spirited away from France on the eve of the Templars' destruction, carried by ships that vanished into fog or hidden in monasteries loyal to Rome. Some believe these treasures were not gold or jewels, but manuscripts, relics, knowledge too volatile to allow into the hands of rivals. The Vatican may have condemned the order publicly. Yet, what if it secretly preserved its inheritance by placing it under the protection of its most trusted allies? The Habsburgs, bound by blood and oath, would have been ideal guardians, powerful enough to shield secrets, yet obedient enough never to reveal them. Vienna itself bore traces of this inheritance. Within the labyrinth of abbeys and palaces, rumors tell of knights in plain garments advising emperors. Their counsel was never recorded, but their presence unmistakable. Court chroniclers wrote of mysterious benefactors who arrived with chests of documents and departed with silence as their only receipt. Who were these men? If not remnants of a brotherhood thought extinct, perhaps the Templars had not been destroyed at all, but transfigured, their armor exchanged for robes, their banner hidden beneath the fabric of dynastic power. Consider the strange persistence of symbols. The Templar cross, though outlawed, appeared subtly in Habsburg heraldry, carved into chapels, engraved on rings passed through generations. Was this coincidence, or a quiet acknowledgement that the order's flame still burned, sheltered beneath the dynasty's wings? Even more curious are records of marriages arranged with families once tied to Templar estates, as though bloodlines themselves were being preserved in secrecy. Were these coincidences of politics or careful continuations of a hidden brotherhood? The paradox emerges when we compare what the Habsburgs displayed publicly and what they concealed in silence. They were the champions of Catholic orthodoxy, defenders of the altar, and private guardians of papal decrees. The silence surrounding certain relics and archives suggests they were entrusted with material never meant to be seen. Could it be that their fiercest loyalty to the church was not faith alone, but the burden of guardianship? The knowledge that exposure would unravel not only their dynasty, but the Vatican itself? The suppression of the Templars was justified by charges of heresy, idolatry, and blasphemy. Yet, historians have long noted the thinness of this evidence, the lack of proof strong enough to condemn an order so vast. What if the true reason was not heresy, but possession? Possession of knowledge too great to allow beyond control. If so, then the order had to vanish publicly, but persist privately, absorbed into a dynasty that could bear the weight of its inheritance. The Habsburgs, their bloodline purified by ritual unions, became not just rulers, but guardians of something far older than themselves. Legends in Spain tell of chests brought secretly to monasteries after the fall of the Templars, guarded by monks until they were quietly transferred to royal treasuries under Habsburg rule. Some claim these chests contained maps of lands across the Atlantic, knowledge that predated Columbus, charts erased from public record but preserved in silence. If true, then the voyages that brought Spain its empire may not have been discoveries at all, but recoveries guided by knowledge long concealed. Was it coincidence that the dynasty which inherited such treasures also ruled the very empire that reshaped the globe? Or was the expansion itself part of a design written in hidden manuscripts centuries earlier? The Templars were builders, engineers, and visionaries of stone and symbol. Across Europe, their fortresses still rise in ruin, silent testimonies of an order erased yet unforgettable. Within the Habsburg dominions, these ruins often stood untouched, preserved with unusual reverence. Was it nostalgia or recognition? Perhaps the dynasty did not see them as relics of a bygone brotherhood, but as monuments to their own secret inheritance, reminders carved in stone that their guardianship was not a political accident, but an ordained duty. There are accounts, dismissed by scholars but persistent in folklore, that certain Habsburg emperors held private audiences with men described as warrior monks without orders. Advisors who spoke little yet commanded attention. These men never appear in official portraits, yet their shadows stretch long across the dynasty's decisions. Were they remnants of a lineage erased from paper, but alive in flesh? Were they emissaries of a brotherhood reborn in secrecy, still shaping events from the shadows? The silence of history is often more revealing than its words. We are told the Templars perished in disgrace, yet their name refuses to die. Their symbols refuse to fade. Their presence refuses to vanish. The Habsburgs, meanwhile, wielded power greater than armies could explain. Their rise improbably swift, their endurance strangely resilient. Could the answer lie in a hidden continuity, a passing of the torch from knights condemned in fire to emperors crowned in gold? The question lingers like incense in a darkened chapel. What if the Templars never died, but lived on, disguised within the very dynasty that claimed to defend the faith? And if so, what secrets were preserved in the shadows of their court? Secrets that might still lie buried in vaults where stone meets silence, waiting for the moment when memory is allowed to surface once again? A dynasty so vast should have celebrated diversity within its bloodline. Yet the Habsburgs became known for something haunting, the repetition of faces, features, and names across generations, as though portraits were copied rather than newly painted. Visitors to their galleries note the eerie similarity, not only in bearing, but in bone. Jaws thrust forward, lips heavy, eyes fixed in a gaze both noble and unnatural. These faces became mirrors of one another, reflections passed down like heirlooms, until the dynasty itself seemed less a family than an echo chamber of blood. Why preserve such unnatural resemblance, unless the resemblance itself was the point? The Habsburgs' insistence on intermarriage was justified as politics, alliances sealed by kinship, crowns bound together through blood. But whispers suggest that behind these unions lay ritual, an obsession with purity not only of inheritance but of essence. The idea of blood purity was not new. It stretched back through myths of sacred lines, of families chosen to carry a divine spark. Inbreeding may appear reckless to modern eyes, yet for the dynasty it was a deliberate practice, as though the risk of deformity was a price willingly paid to safeguard something invisible. Could it be that their obsession was not foolishness but devotion to an ancient belief? That to dilute their blood was to extinguish their legitimacy? The consequences became legendary. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg of his line in that realm, embodied the paradox with tragic clarity. His jaw protruded grotesquely, his body frail, his mind clouded, yet he was treated as though his blood carried weight beyond his weakness. Physicians marveled at his ailments, courtiers whispered of curses, and the people saw in his deformity not accident but omen. Was he merely the victim of genetic decline, or the sacrificial outcome of a dynasty willing to destroy flesh in order to preserve what it considered divine? His body was frail, yet his crown endured, as though the very act of survival proved that the bloodline had achieved its purpose. In Vienna's chapels and Madrid's palaces, weddings became less celebrations than ceremonies of preservation. Candles burned as vows were spoken between cousins, their faces so alike they seemed siblings rather than spouses. Outsiders questioned, but insiders saw the ritual as necessary, the continuation of a design older than the empire itself. Priests blessed these unions with solemnity, turning what appeared to be political calculation into sacred affirmation. Did the church sanction this because it believed in the dynasty's claim to purity, or because it too recognized that the preservation of this bloodline served a greater hidden purpose? The mirrors extended beyond faces. Names repeated with relentless insistence: Charles, Ferdinand, Philip, until history itself blurred, generations collapsing into one another as though time had no power to distinguish them. Was this habit mere tradition or another sign of ritual? To repeat a name is to repeat an identity, to summon not only memory but continuity. Could it be that the Habsburgs sought to collapse their lineage into a single figure, a perpetual monarch whose essence outlasted mortality? Each heir, then, was not a new ruler, but a mirror reflecting one eternal sovereign, preserved through blood, face, and name. Their obsession with mirrors extended even into their art. In palaces across Europe, halls of reflection multiplied their likeness endlessly, candles flickering against glass until the viewer could not distinguish where the image began or ended. These chambers were not mere decoration, but symbols, statements that the Habsburgs were infinite, their line unbroken, their essence preserved across centuries. Was this arrogance, or was it ritual, an attempt to manifest in architecture the belief that their blood transcended decay? Yet beneath the grandeur lay whispers of deformity. The Habsburg jaw became infamous, a mark so pronounced that physicians today still recognize it in portraits. But what if it was more than a biological consequence? What if it became a badge, a visible sign that their devotion to purity was real, etched into their bodies as though the bloodline itself demanded sacrifice? Just as monks bore scars of devotion, so too did this dynasty bear the deformities of their covenant, proof that they valued lineage over life. Could it be that the grotesque face was not shame, but evidence of loyalty to a secret vow? Legends in Spanish villages told of omens, that the land itself groaned under the weight of such unions, that storms gathered when these marriages were consecrated, that bells tolled unbidden in distant churches. To the people, such signs confirmed that the dynasty was not merely human, but touched by forces larger than life. To scholars, these tales are dismissed as folklore. But what if folklore is memory, blurred but not erased? Perhaps the deformities, the storms, the omens were all part of one continuum, signals that the dynasty's blood carried both blessing and burden. Even today, to walk through galleries of their portraits is to feel unease. Eyes stare from frames, jaws jut forward, lips hang heavy, each face both unique and yet identical. The repetition becomes oppressive, as though the viewer is confronted not with individuals, but with a single essence replicated endlessly. Could it be that this was the dynasty's goal all along, to erase individuality in pursuit of eternal continuity, to become a living mirror of themselves? The paradox persists. The very purity that secured their identity also secured their decline. The same unions that preserved their essence fractured their strength. Their obsession with blood created heirs too fragile to rule, yet it also cemented the myth that their blood was sacred. Was this contradiction merely accident or the inevitable outcome of devotion to a secret belief? Did they see their decline not as failure, but as proof that they had fulfilled their role? That they had preserved their essence until it could be carried forward by another hand? The mirrors remain, both in portraits and in memory. Each face a repetition, each name an echo, each union a ritual. The dynasty became less a family than a reflection, their very deformities transformed into symbols of loyalty to a covenant never spoken, only enacted through blood. What if their true legacy was not empire at all, but the preservation of a mirror, an eternal face staring back at us from history, unchanged, unsettling, and unresolved? On the surface, maps of Europe in the Habsburg era show clear borders, kingdoms and provinces neatly shaded and labeled. Yet these cartographic lines were illusions, symbols of power for the common eye. Behind the visible geography stretched another landscape, one invisible to most, a hidden web of influence connecting Vienna to Madrid, Brussels to Naples, Prague to the New World. The dynasty's true power did not lie merely in territory, but in the secret threads that bound distant realms together, threads that crossed not only borders, but the unseen corridors of faith, commerce, and whispered oaths. Could it be that the geography we know is only the outer shell, and that beneath it lies a map of power designed never to be published? Consider the phrase that followed the Habsburgs, the empire where the sun never set. To most, it meant dominion over lands so vast that daylight always touched one corner or another. But to those who listened more carefully, the phrase held a deeper resonance. The sun never set because their influence was not confined to land or time zones. It stretched invisibly across oceans, hidden in marriage contracts, secret pacts with abbeys, and treaties signed in silence. The world was not divided into countries for them. It was folded into a single fabric of control, sewn with invisible stitches. From Spain, galleons carried silver and gold from the Americas, yet along with treasure came charts, strange artifacts, and maps older than the discoveries themselves. In Vienna, whispers claimed these objects were locked away, their origins never disclosed. Could the dynasty have possessed knowledge of the New World before Columbus sailed, knowledge inherited perhaps from Templar archives or even older civilizations erased from memory? If so, then their expansion across continents was not mere exploration, but the execution of a design already inscribed in secret manuscripts. The official maps shown to the world may have been lies, while the true maps, inked in secrecy, shaped the course of history unseen. In the Low Countries, their dominion tied them to trade routes stretching north and east from the Atlantic to the Baltic. Merchants dealt in cloth, spices, and metals. Yet behind the trade lay coded exchanges. Some contracts bore strange symbols, notations resembling astrological marks rather than accounting. Could these have been signs of hidden orders, ensuring that commerce itself became another thread in the web of control? The Habsburgs did not simply rule kingdoms. They presided over networks, maritime, financial, and spiritual, binding Europe in a geometry of power no mapmaker dared to reveal. Even within Europe, the borders of their influence often defied the lines of politics. Monasteries in remote valleys answered not only to the church but to the dynasty, preserving manuscripts and treasures in vaults accessible only to trusted emissaries. Secret routes linked these outposts, roads unmarked by official maps but remembered in whispers by locals. Pilgrims traveled them without understanding, believing they followed holy paths, when in truth they were tracing corridors of power. What if the true geography of Europe was less about rivers and mountains than about these invisible veins of influence, carrying secrets as lifeblood courses through a body? The paradox becomes striking when we observe how often the dynasty's power seemed untouchable, even when their armies faltered. Borders could collapse, but their influence remained. Why? Because their empire was never truly physical. It was metaphysical, a network of loyalties, relics, and covenants that transcended the battlefield. Even in defeat, their invisible map remained intact. Could it be that this web was their real empire and the territories on parchment merely its outer clothing? Legends in Central Europe spoke of shadow maps, drawings said to be kept in Jesuit archives, revealing hidden connections of power rather than geography. On these maps, monasteries replaced cities, secret routes replaced roads, and symbols replaced borders. Some claim that to view such a map was to glimpse the hidden order of the world, the architecture behind the illusion. If such maps existed, did the Habsburgs use them to govern not land, but destiny itself? Even their palaces reflected this invisible geometry. In Vienna, in Madrid, in Prague, the layout of halls and chapels often aligned with celestial patterns, as though architecture itself was a map, embedding the dynasty's hidden knowledge in stone. Visitors saw grandeur. Initiates saw design. Could it be that the empire's geography was inscribed not on parchment, but on walls, ceilings, and sacred alignments, unseen by the untrained, but unmistakable to those who understood the code? The Habsburgs' reach extended even further through colonial governors and merchants, but their loyalty was never to nations as we know them. It was to the dynasty, and perhaps beyond the dynasty, to the covenant that bound them to the church and to a hidden order. This web was not fragile, it was resilient, surviving wars, revolutions, and even the dynasty's decline. Perhaps it survives still, invisible but enduring, a geometry of influence that continues to shape the world long after the crowns have tarnished. The question remains haunting. What if the borders on our maps are illusions, and the true lines of history are traced in shadows, in routes never drawn, in oaths never recorded? What if the Habsburgs' real legacy is not their vanished empire, but the invisible geography they left behind, a map we are still walking without ever realizing it? Every throne carries its crown, but the Habsburgs carried something more, a crown that was never fully their own. Their authority was draped not only in velvet and gold, but in the shadow of the cross. Coronations dazzled with splendor, choirs lifted voices, incense curled into the air, bishops raised their hands. Yet the moment an emperor knelt before the altar, the ritual revealed its paradox. The crown might glitter with jewels, but it was placed upon their head by the church, and that act alone blurred the line between ruler and servant. Were they monarchs commanding from above or guardians kneeling from below? The Vatican's grip was subtle but absolute. From the very title of Holy Roman Emperor flowed a claim of divine mission, to defend Christendom, to uphold the faith, to protect the church. But such words, wrapped in grandeur, were also chains. To accept the crown was to accept the burden of obedience. Every war against heretics, every crusade against infidels, every suppression of rebellion became not merely a choice, but an obligation. The altar demanded sacrifice, and the Habsburgs became its sword. Could their power truly be called their own when it was consecrated in a way that ensured perpetual dependence? The paradox deepens when we examine how faith and sovereignty entwined. On one hand, the dynasty projected divine legitimacy. Their rule was God's will, their enemies the fires of heaven. On the other, their fate was controlled by the church, which could strip legitimacy as easily as it bestowed it. Excommunication loomed like a blade over any ruler who resisted. How could an emperor who ruled half the world be brought to his knees by a single decree? Unless, of course, his crown had never belonged to him in the first place. Yet there are signs that the Habsburgs embraced this bond with more than resignation. Some saw themselves less as rulers than as instruments, chosen vessels for a mission larger than empire. This belief infused their identity not only with the right to govern, but with the duty to preserve. To preserve what, precisely, remains uncertain. Was it the supremacy of the church or something far more arcane? Knowledge and relics entrusted to them as custodians? The Vatican blessed them not merely because of politics, but because their bloodline had proven loyal, obedient, willing to sacrifice itself to keep dangerous truths hidden from the wider world. Consider the wars of religion that fractured Europe. The Protestant Reformation tore at the foundations of the Catholic order. Yet the Habsburgs stood as its fiercest defenders. They poured lives and fortunes into decades of conflict, as though fighting not merely for power, but for existence itself. To fail would not only weaken their empire, it would sever their bond with the church, a bond that defined their very identity. Did the dynasty fight for faith or for the invisible covenant that bound their lineage to the Vatican's secrets? The difference may be less than we imagine. In palaces and abbeys, coronation relics were guarded with almost mystical reverence. Crowns, orbs, scepters, and robes were treated as though they carried more than symbolic weight. Some legends claim that certain objects, stones set in crowns, fragments embedded in crucifixes, were relics held by the Templars, transferred quietly into Habsburg possession. If so, then coronations were not mere ceremonies of power, but rituals of continuity, in which the dynasty renewed a role stretching back to forbidden brotherhoods. The crown upon their head might have glittered, but the true inheritance lay in what it symbolized: a responsibility to guard secrets too ancient for daylight. Observers often marveled at the dynasty's uncanny endurance. Armies were defeated, territories lost, heirs died without children, yet still the Habsburgs persisted as though shielded by something stronger than fortune. Could the explanation lie in their alliance with the altar, which not only sanctified but also protected them? Papal diplomacy often rescued them from ruin, weaving webs of compromise that ensured survival. But what if this survival was not merely political, but essential, ordained to ensure that guardianship continued unbroken? The Church could not allow the dynasty to fall. Its fall would risk exposing what was meant to remain sealed. Yet obedience was never simple. Within the dynasty grew tensions between sovereignty and servitude, between the desire to rule independently and the necessity to kneel. Some emperors resisted, others embraced, but none escaped. To wear the crown was to accept the chain. And in that paradox lies a haunting truth. The dynasty may have seemed the masters of Europe, but in truth they may have been servants, their power an illusion, sustained only to preserve the altar's hidden authority. The imagery of crown and cross persists in memory. Paintings depict emperors kneeling, bishops standing, hands outstretched in blessing. But one must ask, who truly ruled in those moments? Was it the man crowned with gold, or the hand that lowered the crown upon his head? The question lingers, unsettling, as though the glitter of empire concealed a hollow core. Perhaps the Habsburgs themselves understood this, accepting that their crowns were not symbols of sovereignty, but of servitude, worn not for their glory, but for the preservation of something veiled in silence. And so we return to the paradox. A dynasty remembered as rulers of half the world may, in truth, have been guardians, their crowns less trophies of conquest than seals of obedience. What if the true authority never lay in palaces or armies, but in the altar, where shadows whispered and pacts were sealed, binding emperors more tightly than chains of iron? If so, then the history of Europe is not the story of kings and states, but of crowns bowed to the cross, of empires forged not in freedom but in service to mysteries we are not meant to see. Whispers followed the Habsburgs wherever they ruled, murmurs that their power was drawn not only from crowns and treaties, but from hidden sciences, relics, and secrets passed in silence through cloisters and vaults. Beneath the facade of piety, stories circulated of emperors consulting alchemists, of queens preserving relics wrapped in crimson cloth, of court physicians who seemed more like magicians than healers. Politics explained their armies and marriages. But what explained the aura of mystery that clung to their name? Could it be that their empire was fueled not only by faith and strategy, but by a hidden current of forbidden knowledge flowing beneath the surface? For in their courts, alchemy was more than idle curiosity. It was continuity, a whisper of the same covenant that bound them to the cross, the altar, and perhaps to secrets far older than either. In Prague, in Madrid, in Vienna, laboratories glowed with furnaces where metals were transmuted and strange vapors coiled upward like prayers. Chroniclers describe emperors who spent long nights listening to the whispers of alchemists who promised not only gold, but revelation, the unlocking of secrets hidden in nature itself. Rudolf II, perhaps the most enigmatic of them all, turned his court into a labyrinth of experiments, summoning thinkers, mystics, and visionaries from across Europe. To some, he appeared eccentric, even mad, but to others he seemed chosen, a monarch safeguarding ancient knowledge under the guise of obsession. Was alchemy truly about wealth, or was it a code for something far deeper? Fragments of wisdom inherited from orders the world believed destroyed. Blood itself became an object of fascination. Healers whispered of its purity, its corruption, its ability to carry not only life but memory. The dynasty's notorious inbreeding, so often dismissed as folly, may also have been tied to such beliefs. If blood carried essence, then to preserve it was to preserve something sacred. Even if flesh paid the price, the grotesque features of later generations were not merely accidents of genetics. They became marks of devotion, visible proof that the family valued essence over health. Could it be that the obsession with blood purity was not political superstition, but a ritual echo of secret sciences, where blood was more than biology, where it was a key, a vessel, perhaps even a covenant? Legends tell of relics hidden in monasteries under Habsburg patronage, fragments of the true cross, chalices once carried by knights, bones wrapped in silk and guarded by monks who swore silence. These relics were never displayed to the public, never paraded through the streets as in other kingdoms. Instead, they were locked in vaults, shown only to emperors, whispered about in tones of awe and dread. What purpose did they serve? Were they talismans or reminders of obligations stretching back centuries? Could their secrecy indicate that they were not merely symbols of faith, but objects whose power was considered too dangerous to expose in Spain? Rumors grew of a chamber within the Escorial, the vast monastery palace built under Philip II, said to contain not only books banned by the Inquisition, but manuscripts carried from the East, written in languages few could decipher. Some whispered that among them were Templar writings, alchemical treatises, and fragments of knowledge rescued from fallen civilizations. Why preserve what was forbidden? Unless the dynasty's role was not to destroy heresy, but to guard dangerous wisdom, keeping it safe under the cloak of obedience to the church. Could the Habsburgs have been both defenders of faith and protectors of knowledge declared forbidden, holding contradictions within their very core? The paradox emerges clearly here. They punished heresy, yet preserved heretical texts. They defended the church, yet were rumored to shelter remnants of orders condemned by it. They claimed purity of faith, yet courted alchemists, astrologers, and mystics. How can such contradictions be reconciled unless their true role was not what history tells us? Perhaps they were entrusted with dual missions, to appear as guardians of orthodoxy while secretly preserving fragments of knowledge the Vatican dared not destroy. Could their courts have been less centers of power and more secret archives where relics and sciences survived in silence, waiting for the world to be ready or never ready to receive them? Even in art, hints appear. Paintings commissioned by Habsburg patrons often depicted not only saints and martyrs, but coded imagery, planets, alchemical symbols, patterns of geometry that spoke to initiates in ways invisible to the common eye. To the faithful, they were beautiful devotions. To the learned, they were encrypted manuscripts in color and light. Could it be that the dynasty used art itself as a vault, hiding knowledge in plain sight, disguising science as faith, ensuring survival without detection? The whispers of blood, relics, and alchemy refuse to vanish. They cling to the dynasty like incense in a chapel, faint but persistent, always present beneath the surface. Perhaps we dismiss them because they sound too strange, too unsettling, too contradictory. Yet contradictions often hide truth. Could it be that the Habsburgs' real power did not rest in armies or marriages, but in the dangerous privilege of holding what should have been destroyed, secrets too volatile to reveal, too sacred to lose, too forbidden to share? The silence remains heavy, impenetrable, as though the relics, manuscripts, and alchemical formulas still lie hidden, waiting in vaults guarded by stone and memory. We are left with questions rather than answers, fragments rather than clarity. Did the dynasty truly wield forbidden knowledge? Or did it merely play the part of guardians, never allowed to glimpse the full truth themselves? What if their empire was not built upon land at all, but upon the invisible weight of secrets passed through blood, sealed in silence, and carried like a hidden flame across centuries? In Madrid, the golden light of empire once poured through palaces where rulers walked in grandeur. Yet behind the glittering facades lingered omens that unsettled even the faithful. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, at the height of its glory, carried both the riches of the New World and the burden of mysteries whispered in shadows. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the paradox of triumph and decay revealed itself most starkly. For while Spain's empire stretched across oceans, within its royal chambers were signs, symbols, afflictions, and silences that suggested something darker beneath the gold. Was Spain's golden age built not only upon conquest and treasure, but also upon pacts inked in secrecy, pacts whose costs were paid in silence? Philip II, remembered as the great defender of the Catholic faith, built the Escorial, that vast monastery palace, which still stands like a fortress of stone and shadow. To visitors, it was a symbol of devotion, a monument to God and empire. Yet its geometry, severe and imposing, resembled less a palace than a labyrinth, with chambers aligned to celestial patterns and corridors leading to sealed vaults. Within these vaults, it is said, lay not only relics of saints, but forbidden manuscripts, books confiscated by the Inquisition but never burned. Why preserve what should have been destroyed, unless the dynasty, while condemning heresy in public, was tasked with protecting knowledge too dangerous to reveal, sealing it within walls disguised as devotion? Even the chambers of Philip himself bore strange marks. Chroniclers noted his obsession with omens, eclipses, storms, the sudden death of heirs. Some described him as haunted, his faith both unshakable and fragile, as though he knew he served powers greater than his own throne. Did he fear God alone, or did he also fear the silence of the Vatican's vaults, where the true weight of his inheritance lay? Perhaps his devotion was not merely piety, but the recognition that his bloodline's role was less about rule than about guardianship carried out under the gaze of the Church. The symbols carved into the Escorial suggest more than architecture. Some windows align with solstices. Some chambers echo with proportions recalling sacred geometry. Scholars dismiss these as coincidence, yet the precision defies accident. Was the Escorial itself a coded structure, a monument not only to empire, but to esoteric knowledge preserved through stone? If so, then Spain's monarchs walked daily within a map of mysteries, their palace itself a vault of encoded secrets. To ordinary eyes, it was grandeur. To initiates, it may have been a message. But the omens grew heavier with each generation. The Spanish Habsburgs, more than their Austrian kin, displayed the toll of their obsession with bloodline purity. Charles II, the last of his line, embodied this paradox fully. Weak in body, plagued by illness, yet revered as a king whose blood was considered sacred. His very deformities became a kind of symbol, as though the dynasty's devotion to purity had been etched visibly into his flesh. Was this tragedy, or was it the final proof of loyalty to a covenant that demanded sacrifice of the body for preservation of essence? His reign ended in childless silence, yet even that silence seems too deliberate, too staged, as though his life had been the closing ritual of a long ceremony. Legends whispered through Madrid of chambers sealed after his death, where documents and relics were hidden away so completely that no successor might find them. Monks spoke of signs appearing in the sky at his passing and of bells that tolled without hands to pull their ropes. To the common people, these were omens of God's will. To the dynasty's chroniclers, they were warnings, proof that the line had fulfilled its purpose and could pass no further. Could it be that Spain's decline was not merely political, but ritual, an ending foreseen and accepted by those who knew the covenant's design? The Spanish Armada fits uneasily into this puzzle. Official history speaks of storms that shattered the Great Fleet, divine winds that saved England from invasion. Yet in Spain, whispers grew that the Armada had been doomed not by weather alone, but by betrayal, or even sacrifice. Some believed the dynasty had agreed, under Vatican pressure, to a hidden purpose, sending the fleet to its ruin as a ritual offering, a blood price to preserve the larger covenant. Why else would a force so vast, so prepared, crumble in such strange fashion? What if the Armada's defeat was not failure, but fulfillment of a vow hidden behind the veil of war, whispered in the royal chapels of Madrid? Visitors still see altars glittering with relics, paintings of saints gazing down in silence. Yet some relics never appear, locked away from public sight, whispered about only in fragments. Bones carried from Jerusalem, chalices of uncertain origin, crucifixes said to hold fragments of older faiths. Why guard these in secrecy while displaying others openly? Unless these relics were too closely tied to forbidden legacies. The Templars, the early church, perhaps even civilizations erased from memory. Could it be that the dynasty's Spanish branch was entrusted with the heaviest guardianship of all, bearing relics that could unravel the narrative of faith itself if revealed? The golden age of Spain shines brightly in textbooks, but its shadows are seldom explored. For every galleon of silver that crossed the Atlantic, there may have been ships carrying cargo not listed on manifests, sealed chests, coded manuscripts, artifacts whispered of but never acknowledged. Some may still lie buried beneath Spanish soil or sealed in vaults beneath the Escorial, waiting for light that may never come. If such things exist, then Spain's empire was not built merely on conquest and plunder, but on guardianship of secrets inherited from vanished brotherhoods. The paradox remains chilling. The dynasty's Spanish glory coincided with decline, as though power itself was poisoned, its brilliance a mask for weakness. Was this irony of history, or was it design, a ritual written into the very structure of the covenant, binding the dynasty to church and secrecy? What if the so-called Golden Age was never about Spain at all, but about preserving shadows, ensuring that knowledge, relics, and vows passed silently into the future, even as the empire itself crumbled? The question lingers in the silence of Madrid's palaces, in the stone corridors of the Escorial, in the faded portraits of monarchs who stare with weary eyes. Did they know their glory was hollow, their crowns borrowed, their empire an illusion concealing a duty older and darker than conquest? And if they knew, did they accept the silence willingly, or did they carry it like a curse until the dynasty itself fell into shadow? The emperors of the Holy Roman Empire were crowned with splendor, their processions stretching through cities filled with banners, bells, and incense. Yet behind the majesty lay a burden that cannot be seen in paintings or parades, a burden whispered of in chronicles that dared not speak too plainly. For each Habsburg emperor, upon receiving the crown, also received an invisible weight, obligations, vows, and secrets that bound him as tightly as the coronation robes. The grandeur dazzled the eyes of subjects, but the silence pressed against the emperor's shoulders like chains. What did these men truly inherit when they knelt before the altar? To many, the title of Holy Roman Emperor meant supreme authority. Yet in truth, it was a paradox. They were called rulers of Christendom, but their power was tethered to the Vatican's blessing and to covenants inked long before their reigns. Some accounts suggest that each emperor was initiated into knowledge that ordinary kings were never allowed to touch, fragments of chronicles older than Christendom, relics carried from Jerusalem, documents recovered from the ruins of Constantinople. If true, then their burden was not only to govern, but to guard. Could this explain the haunted expressions captured in portraits, eyes staring past the viewer into depths unseen? The case of Charles Futh reveals the paradox in sharp relief. He ruled more land than any monarch of his age, his empire stretching from Iberia to the Americas, from the Low Countries to Austria. Yet despite this, he abdicated, retreating into a monastery where he lived in silence, as though the crown had become unbearable. Historians call it exhaustion. But what if it was something more? What if the knowledge he carried, the weight of secrets entrusted to him, drove him to seek solitude, to escape the burden that glittering crowns concealed? Was abdication an act of weakness or the final step in fulfilling a vow known only to him? Other emperors carried their burden differently. Rudolf II, whose fascination with alchemy turned his court into a labyrinth of mystics, seemed consumed by the hidden mission. He gathered relics, manuscripts, and scholars, creating in Prague a court that resembled less a palace than an archive. To outsiders, he appeared eccentric, distracted, even mad. But perhaps his obsession was the natural result of being initiated into the dynasty's secret duty, the guardianship of dangerous knowledge. If so, then his reign was not chaos but continuation, a reflection of the dynasty's hidden role. The burden was also political, for the dynasty's wars were not always of their choosing. When the Vatican called, the emperors responded, sending armies into battle against Protestants, heretics, and infidels. But beneath the surface, one wonders if these wars were less about faith and more about preservation of the covenant that bound them to the altar, the defense of secrets too dangerous to risk falling into rebellious hands. Could it be that blood spilled across Europe was not only for religion but for silence, a silence guarded at any cost? Legends speak of ceremonies held not in cathedrals but in vaults, where emperors were shown relics and manuscripts passed hand to hand through generations. Some describe a ritual in which the new sovereign was brought before a chest sealed with wax, its contents revealed only once, never spoken of again. What lay inside? Was it a relic, a document, a map of forbidden knowledge? No one knows. Yet the pattern of secrecy repeats so consistently that one cannot dismiss it as invention. Perhaps the emperor's greatest burden was not public duty, but private knowledge, knowledge that haunted him until his last breath. Even their deaths bore the mark of this weight. Charles Fee's retreat into silence, Rudolf Secker's madness, Ferdinand II's desperate wars. Each ending reflects not merely personal fate, but the strain of carrying something unspoken. These men commanded armies, yet their greatest battles may have been fought in silence, against the knowledge that their crowns made them not sovereigns, but custodians. To rule was one thing, to guard the unguardable was another, and yet each emperor, willingly or not, accepted this burden, bound by the blood and faith of his dynasty. The paradox sharpens when we consider their decline. The later emperors, weakened by frailty and inbreeding, still bore the same obligations. Even when their empire fractured, even when their armies faltered, the burden remained. Why persist in a duty that seemed to destroy them? Unless the duty itself was considered sacred, its fulfillment more important than the survival of the line. Perhaps the dynasty was willing to collapse so long as the secrets entrusted to them remained hidden. Could their decline then be seen not as failure, but as sacrifice, the final price of loyalty to a covenant older than their crowns? What remains most unsettling is that the burden cannot be traced directly, only felt in echoes. The haunted eyes of portraits, the strange obsessions of emperors, the silences in chronicles where details should have been written. These absences speak louder than records. They suggest that behind the grandeur of coronations lay an inheritance never meant to be spoken. An inheritance that weighed heavier than gold, heavier than empire itself. The question remains unanswered and unresolved. Were the Habsburg emperors rulers of Europe or guardians of shadows? Did they sit upon thrones for their own sake or as watchmen over relics, secrets, and covenants hidden from the world? The silence of history offers no reply, only the lingering image of crowns gleaming while invisible chains tightened unseen. Beneath the grandeur of Habsburg palaces and cathedrals hidden from the eyes of visitors, there existed another empire, one built not of land or armies, but of pages, shelves, and manuscripts bound in silence. Libraries formed the hidden arteries of their dominion, repositories where knowledge outlawed elsewhere was quietly preserved. To the public, the dynasty was a defender of faith, burning heretical texts and silencing dangerous voices. Yet behind closed doors, they gathered those very works into vaults, chained them to shelves, locked them in cabinets. Was this hypocrisy, or was it the fulfillment of a duty too dangerous to declare in Vienna? The State Hall of the Hofburg dazzles tourists with fresco and marble, but even today there are cabinets never opened, volumes never cataloged, manuscripts whose existence is denied. Chroniclers whispered that some of these books bore the marks of suppressed orders, texts once owned by the Templars, alchemical treatises, grimoires of ancient origin. Why would the dynasty preserve what the Inquisition condemned unless their role was not merely to destroy, but to guard, ensuring that dangerous memory was not erased, but contained? Could it be that their libraries were less places of study and more vaults of containment, prisons for knowledge too volatile to be released? The Jesuits, ever close to Habsburg power, played their part as custodians of secrecy. Their ciphers appear in marginalia, strange symbols decorating otherwise ordinary manuscripts. To the untrained eye, they were flourishes. To initiates, they were keys. In some cases, even the bindings concealed secrets, double covers hiding texts within texts, invisible until pulled apart by careful hands. Was this only scholarly ingenuity or evidence of a deliberate system designed to preserve hidden wisdom across centuries? The silence of these shelves suggests a continuity no revolution could erase. Prague under Rudolf II became the most enigmatic of all. His court gathered manuscripts from every corner of Europe, filling halls with scrolls and volumes that blurred the line between science and sorcery. Alchemical diagrams, astronomical charts, and texts rumored to be written in tongues no one could decipher were guarded as treasures. The emperor himself, fascinated to the point of obsession, turned his palace into a labyrinth of books. To his critics, it was madness, yet to others, it was guardianship. Perhaps he understood that his dynasty's true role was not to rule bodies, but to preserve minds. Minds long silenced, voices long erased, yet still whispering through the ink of forbidden pages. Even in Spain, the Escorial served as more than a palace monastery. Its vast library, arranged with symbolic geometry, contained works banned across Europe. Some volumes were chained to lecterns not to prevent theft, but to ensure confinement. Philip II, stern defender of Catholic faith, paradoxically became the guardian of heretical texts. Why would the most devout monarch preserve what his Inquisition burned elsewhere? Could it be that his dynasty was ordered not to destroy, but to safeguard? The contradiction is unsettling, yet perhaps it reveals the dynasty's hidden covenant, to guard what could never be shown, to preserve what must never be taught. Legends persist of one vault in Austria, beneath the Benedictine Abbey of Melk, where manuscripts were said to be stored in chambers lined with stone, accessible only to monks sworn to secrecy. Among these were fragments of atlases, maps of lands uncharted, diagrams of stars arranged in patterns no longer recognized, genealogies tracing not only human lines, but something more mysterious. Did these manuscripts preserve memories of civilizations erased from official history? Survivors of floods or fires long forgotten? And if so, then the Habsburgs were less rulers than archivists, chosen to preserve humanity's forbidden memory under the guise of empire. The paradox sharpens when we recall that revolutions swept away libraries elsewhere, yet the Habsburg collection survived. Fires destroyed archives in Paris, invasions plundered Rome, and yet the dynasty's shelves endured. Was this chance or was it protection? Perhaps their survival was not accident but mandate, as though the libraries themselves were guarded by destiny, shielded to ensure continuity. Could it be that history itself conspired to preserve these vaults, because within them lay fragments that once erased could never be restored? Art itself became part of the archive. Illuminated manuscripts preserved symbols invisible to the casual reader, embedding codes in margins, miniature drawings, flourishes that carried hidden meaning. Even music, some argue, was coded. Compositions commissioned by Habsburg patrons allegedly carried mathematical patterns that mirrored cosmological designs. Were these coincidences of culture or deliberate acts of preservation embedding forbidden knowledge into forms that would escape suspicion? Perhaps the dynasty's libraries were not confined to shelves at all, but scattered across art, music, and architecture. A hidden archive disguised as beauty. Today, when we stand in those halls and gaze upon shelves of leather-bound volumes, we see history. But what we do not see is the silence that lingers. Locked cabinets, forbidden sections, catalogs that omit certain titles. These absences speak louder than words. They tell us that something remains, hidden in plain sight, preserved not for us, but for some future, or perhaps never for any future at all. The question lingers in the silence of these libraries. Were the Habsburgs true believers who kept heretical texts only to suppress them, or were they custodians tasked with something far stranger, the preservation of humanity's forbidden memory, fragments too dangerous to be destroyed, yet too perilous to be revealed? The answer lies sealed in vaults of stone and parchment, where words sleep in silence, waiting for eyes that may never be allowed to read them. Marriage in the Habsburg dynasty was never simply about union. It was performance, ritual, and contract woven together in silence. The public saw festivals, parades, and chapels glowing with candlelight as cousins, nieces, and uncles exchanged vows before altars. But beneath the layers of silk and incense, something else unfolded. Hidden agreements, whispered oaths, treaties never read aloud, inked in rooms far removed from the spectacle. What was truly sealed at these weddings? Was it the bond of two hearts, or the reinforcement of covenants that reached beyond dynastic ambition, binding the family ever tighter to the Vatican and to shadows older still? Each marriage acted as a hinge of history, closing one chapter while opening another. The faces of Europe's royalty became entwined like the threads of a tapestry. Yet it was not only crowns and dowries that passed between them. There were gifts never displayed, documents never entered into public record. Legends tell of scrolls wrapped in wax, relics wrapped in silk, handed from one family to another under cover of celebration. Were these merely symbolic tokens or fragments of something more? Remnants of Templar knowledge, sacred relics guarded by those who understood their power? Could the dynasty's obsession with intermarriage have been less about politics than about continuity of guardianship? Ensuring that nothing slipped beyond the reach of loyal bloodlines, the spectacle itself carried coded meaning. Guests watched processions of brides and grooms walking solemnly into chapels. Yet symbols woven into garments, gestures of bishops, and even the arrangement of candles often hinted at layers unseen. Chroniclers described processions that moved in patterns echoing celestial alignments, or rituals whispered in Latin before the vows were spoken aloud. Did the audience see only half the ceremony, while the true ritual remained hidden in the shadows of sacristies? If so, then marriage for the Habsburgs was less sacrament than cipher, a way to perform one reality in public while enacting another in secret. Consider the union of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, often remembered as the origin of Spain's power. Their marriage united kingdoms, but whispers suggest it also brought relics into Habsburg hands, relics connected to Jerusalem and guarded for generations. Later unions, like that of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy, followed similar patterns, alliances that appeared political on the surface, yet coincided curiously with the sudden rise of the family's fortunes. Could these leaps forward have been fueled not merely by inheritance, but by access to hidden treasuries of knowledge and relics, transferred quietly under the guise of dowry? The paradox deepens with the repetition of faces across these marriages. Cousins wed cousins, bloodlines folding in upon themselves until the family tree looked less like branches and more like a mirror. Outsiders saw fragility, but insiders may have seen necessity, the deliberate preservation of blood that had been chosen long before. Some whispered that purity was demanded by a covenant, and each marriage renewed that vow. Could it be that deformities, illnesses, and tragedies were accepted as sacrifices, necessary prices for the preservation of what lay hidden in their lineage behind the celebratory banquets? Where musicians played and tables overflowed, agreements were signed in shadow. These contracts rarely appeared in official archives. Instead, they were kept in private collections, some later discovered with strange signatures, symbols resembling crosses of the Templars or seals known only to clerics. What do we make of such marks? Were they the superstitions of scribes or signs that each marriage was also a pact, reaffirming bonds that tied the dynasty not only to each other, but to a hidden order that had not truly vanished? The Vatican's role in these unions was both obvious and invisible. Priests presided at altars, but cardinals and antechambers ensured that every match aligned with the church's design. Marriages were tools not only of politics, but of obedience, ensuring that loyalty to Rome was never broken. Yet rumors persisted that the Vatican also used these unions as conduits, transferring responsibilities, relics, and secret knowledge between branches of the family. Was the church merely blessing love and alliance, or was it orchestrating continuity of guardianship, ensuring that what once belonged to forbidden orders never slipped beyond control? Even in decline, the dynasty maintained the pattern. The fragile Charles II of Spain married twice, though he produced no heir. Both marriages were orchestrated with unusual intensity by the Vatican, as though more was at stake than succession. Some whispered that relics or manuscripts were being transferred quietly through his queens, cloaked as dowries or gifts. Was the desperate insistence on his unions a final attempt to preserve something hidden before the line collapsed? If so, then even his frailty, his tragic silence, became part of the ritual. The memory of these weddings lingers not only in archives, but in folklore. Villagers spoke of candles that would not burn during certain ceremonies, or of storms breaking suddenly as vows were spoken. Some said bells rang by themselves at the moment of union, as though unseen hands confirmed the vows. To skeptics, these are legends, but legends often preserve memory distorted by time. Perhaps they recall the sense that these weddings were more than human affairs, that something vast and hidden watched from the shadows, waiting for vows to be renewed. What remains most unsettling is how consistently these unions coincided with the preservation of power. Even in moments of weakness, when borders shifted, wars raged, and heirs died, the dynasty endured through marriage. Was this simply the pragmatism of rulers, or evidence of a deeper mission carried in silence? If each marriage was also a transfer of guardianship, then the weddings of the Habsburgs were less celebrations than rituals of continuity, binding not only kingdoms, but secrets across centuries. The question endures like a whisper in the silence of abandoned chapels. What if the true vows of the Habsburgs were never those spoken aloud, but those inked in hidden contracts, sealed in vaults, whispered only between crowns and crosses? What if every wedding was less about love or politics and more about ensuring that the guardianship of forbidden legacies never broke, never slipped, never vanished into the night? In the halls of power, kings were never without advisors. Yet among the Habsburgs, there appeared a presence unlike the usual courtiers and diplomats. Dressed as priests, scholars, or confessors, these men spoke in whispers, offering counsel that seemed to shape decisions far beyond their apparent station. Their words were often veiled, their messages cloaked in symbols, their advice delivered not in commands, but in riddles. Chroniclers hint at their influence, yet rarely named them, as if fear or oath forbade disclosure. Who were these shadowed advisors, if not emissaries of the Jesuits, masters of cipher, guardians of secrets older than the dynasty itself? The Jesuit order, born in the turbulence of the 16th century, proclaimed itself a militant arm of the Church, defending faith against heresy with intellect and discipline. Yet their reputation carried an aura of mystery. Their writings were encrypted, their allegiances whispered about, their missions spanning continents. To ordinary observers, they were missionaries and educators. To the dynasty, they became something else, voices in the shadows, interpreters of secrets no emperor dared to read alone. Could it be that the Jesuits acted not merely as spiritual guides, but as keepers of knowledge passed silently from the Vatican's vaults into Habsburg courts? Consider the strange consistency of Jesuit influence. Wherever the Habsburgs ruled, the order appeared, their colleges rising near palaces, their confessors seated close to thrones. They taught princes, advised queens, and counseled emperors. But more than guidance, they carried ciphered manuscripts, notes written in codes indecipherable to outsiders. These notes, some scholars say, contained instructions not only for policy but for ritual, detailing what relics to preserve, what texts to guard, what unions to arrange. Why encrypt such advice unless it contained matters too dangerous to trust to plain language? What if the dynasty's very survival depended on these hidden missives? Threads invisible, yet binding rulers to obligations laid upon their bloodline. The Jesuits' reputation for secrecy only fed suspicion that their role went far beyond education. Their training in languages, sciences, and philosophy made them invaluable, but their loyalty was never to monarchs, it was to the Vatican, and perhaps to a deeper covenant. If they advised emperors, it was not for the dynasty's glory, but for the preservation of a mission entrusted to them. Could the Habsburgs have been less sovereigns than vessels, steered quietly by priests who whispered truths never spoken aloud? Legends abound of letters carried in Jesuit hands, sealed in wax with symbols not of Rome but of older orders, marks resembling Templar crosses or arcane sigils. Some believe these were instructions for preserving relics, others that they contained fragments of lost scriptures. The dynasty obeyed these letters with curious devotion, even when the commands defied political sense. Marriages arranged at the Vatican's insistence. Wars fought despite futility, alliances pursued against reason. All bear the mark of invisible instruction. Was this political strategy or obedience to a script encrypted centuries before? The paradox grows when we consider how emperors both trusted and feared their Jesuit confessors. These men heard their secrets, absolved their sins, and whispered counsel in their ears. Yet they also carried reports back to Rome, ensuring that no ruler ever truly acted alone. The very act of confession became a channel through which the Vatican shaped imperial policy. Did emperors confess sins, or did they confess secrets? Secrets then translated into coded directives that bound the dynasty ever tighter to its hidden mission. Even architecture reveals the depth of Jesuit influence. Churches built under their design often incorporated symbols hidden in stone, geometric arrangements, inscriptions, and frescoes that to the faithful were decoration, but to the initiated were ciphers. Some of these churches rose directly beside Habsburg palaces, as though to remind rulers daily of the invisible guidance shaping their reigns. Could these buildings have been more than places of worship, functioning also as repositories of encoded messages, physical ciphers in which the dynasty's guardianship was inscribed? The Jesuits' role extended beyond Europe into the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Their missions gathered knowledge of lands unknown, charting stars, recording languages, collecting artifacts. Much of this information flowed quietly back to Europe, and some of it, legends say, into Habsburg vaults. Were the Jesuits serving merely the church, or were they also expanding the dynasty's archive of forbidden knowledge, filling it with fragments from across the globe? If so, then every mission, every conversion, every journey was not only religious but archival, preserving pieces of a puzzle no single generation could complete. Suspicion hardened into fear as the order grew too powerful. Eventually, the Jesuits were suppressed, expelled from several realms, accused of manipulating kings and undermining sovereignty. Yet the Habsburgs never turned fully against them. They recognized too well that their own survival was interwoven with the order's whispers. To sever ties would have meant abandoning the script that had guided them for centuries. Could it be that suppression itself was a performance, a public act disguising the continued influence of a brotherhood too deeply embedded to uproot? The question lingers. Were the Jesuits merely advisors, or were they the hidden scribes of history, writing the dynasty's destiny in ciphers and whispers? Did the Habsburgs rule Europe, or did they act as instruments of messages carried in silence from vault to court? Generation after generation, the silence of their archives suggests that the truth remains encoded still, waiting for eyes able to read what was never meant to be spoken aloud. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 has long been told as a tale of storms and strategy, of England's luck and Spain's misfortune. Yet the story carries shadows that do not fade, details that never quite align with the neat explanations of textbooks. How could the most formidable fleet of its age, constructed with the wealth of empire and sanctified by the blessing of Rome, crumble so completely against winds and waves? Was this truly the hand of nature, or was it something else? An agreement hidden behind the veil of war, a sacrifice disguised as defeat. Philip II had assembled the Armada not merely as a military force, but as a holy mission. The fleet sailed under banners of the cross, its campaign framed as a crusade against Protestant England. Priests marched the decks, relics were carried aboard, blessings bestowed as though the Armada itself were a floating cathedral. Yet the outcome was devastation. Ships wrecked on foreign shores, sailors starved and drowned, and Spain's aura of invincibility shattered. If this was only a storm, it was one of curious timing, striking precisely when the dynasty's enemies needed salvation. Was it chance, or was the Armada doomed before it ever set sail? Whispers in Madrid hinted that the disaster had been foreseen. Some claimed astrologers warned the king, others that Jesuit confessors spoke of ominous signs. Still others murmured that the Vatican itself had hesitated, reluctant to unleash a force that might destabilize the balance of power it so carefully maintained. Could the Armada have been sent into defeat, not despite Rome's knowledge, but because of it? Its ruin serving as a ritual offering, a blood price to preserve greater secrets? If thousands perished, perhaps their deaths were not meaningless, but sacrificial. Their fleet, a vessel offered to the sea in fulfillment of vows no one dared to write. The ships themselves carried more than soldiers and cannon. Chroniclers suggest sealed chests were loaded aboard, their contents never revealed. Were these merely supplies or relics intended for delivery to England had the invasion succeeded? Some believe manuscripts, even fragments of Templar lore, were among them, destined for safe houses in the north should the Armada prevail. If so, their loss at sea was not only military, but esoteric, knowledge swallowed by the ocean's depths, secrets buried in wrecks that even now lie silent beneath the waves. What if the Armada's true mission was not conquest, but transfer? an attempt to move fragments of forbidden heritage across waters under cover of war? The paradox deepens when we examine the response to defeat. Rather than collapse entirely, the dynasty endured. Spain remained a power, though shaken, and the Habsburgs continued to rule across Europe. Could it be that the Armada's destruction was not ruin but exchange, the fulfillment of a hidden pact in which visible loss concealed invisible preservation? If the dynasty surrendered fleets and soldiers, perhaps it secured in return the survival of something far more important, its guardianship of secrets entrusted by the Vatican. What if the Armada was a sacrifice to ensure continuity, its destruction preventing those secrets from falling into Protestant hands? Legends along the Galician coast tell of wreckage carrying strange cargo, sealed containers locals dared not open, believing them cursed. Fishermen spoke of objects that glowed faintly in the dark, recovered from the sea, only to vanish again into the hands of monks. These tales, dismissed as folklore, echo with uneasy consistency. Could it be that the Armada carried relics whose loss was not accident but design? Their disappearance ensuring they would never be captured, never revealed, only concealed beneath the sea or hidden in abbeys far from scrutiny. Even England's triumph bore curious signs. Queen Elizabeth's victory speech spoke of divine winds, the Protestant wind that scattered the Armada. Yet the rhetoric seemed almost too rehearsed, as though the narrative had been prepared before the storm struck. Was England truly saved by weather, or was the storm itself anticipated, a force summoned or permitted by powers greater than kings? If the Vatican and the dynasty had reason to lose, then England's victory may have been less providence and more performance. The world showed one story, while another played out behind closed doors. The Armada's fate became a symbol, etched into memory as proof that Spain's golden age was fragile. But symbols can be masks. What if the fleet's ruin was never about Spain at all, but about ensuring that the dynasty's hidden mission continued unbroken? Perhaps the loss was necessary, a visible defeat concealing an invisible success. In this way, history's neat explanations collapse, replaced by a question too unsettling to ignore. Was the greatest naval disaster of its age not a failure, but a ritual, a deliberate offering made upon the altar of secrecy? The silence of the sea keeps its answer. Wrecks lie scattered along coasts, their timbers rotting, their cannons rusting, their secrets sealed in salt and sand. Divers recover coins, weapons, fragments of wood, yet the most precious cargo remains absent, hidden or lost. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps the Armada's true treasure was not silver or gold, but memory itself. Memory deliberately erased by waves, leaving behind only whispers and suspicion. And so the paradox remains. Was the Armada destroyed by storm, betrayed by poor planning, undone by fate? Or was its destruction foreordained, part of a covenant older than the war it pretended to fight? If so, then its wreckage is not only at the bottom of the sea, but in the silence of history, where questions linger like ghosts, unanswered, unanswerable, and yet refusing to die. Portraits of the Habsburgs line the galleries of Europe, oil on canvas, gilded frames, faces that stare through centuries. Yet to gaze upon them is to feel unease, for the faces remain eerily familiar across generations. The jaw juts forward, lips heavy, eyes sunken with a gaze that seems both regal and resigned. Even when centuries separate the portraits, they appear less like ancestors and descendants than like reflections of the same figure, as though time itself bent to preserve a single visage. Could it be that this was no accident of inheritance, but the outward sign of a lineage deliberately engineered, its continuity marked in flesh? The infamous Habsburg jaw has become a symbol of dynastic decline, a deformity caused by generations of inbreeding. But what if it was also a badge, a visible seal of devotion to blood purity, meant to preserve their essence? The dynasty risked fragility, sacrificing health and strength for continuity of blood. Was the deformity truly a curse, or was it accepted as proof that their mission was being fulfilled, their lineage preserved at all costs? Perhaps what looks grotesque to us was seen by them as sacred, an external sign of loyalty to a hidden covenant. Even more unsettling is how little the features changed over centuries. Compare the portraits of Maximilian the Fair, Charles V, Philip II, and Charles II, and one sees uncanny resemblance, as though time had failed to sculpt individuality. Names repeated endlessly: Charles, Ferdinand, Philip, further collapsing distinction until the dynasty appeared less like a family and more like a single entity, reproduced again and again. Was this mere tradition or ritual, an attempt to manifest eternity by erasing difference? What if each heir was intended not as a new ruler, but as a mirror, reflecting the same eternal figure preserved through face and name? The paradox becomes heavier when we recall how fragile many of these rulers were. Charles II of Spain, whose body bore the full toll of this obsession, was frail, infertile, barely able to govern. Yet his crown was never taken from him, as though the preservation of his blood was more important than his ability to rule. Why cling to a sovereign so broken, unless the broken body itself fulfilled a purpose? Perhaps the dynasty's true role was not governance, but guardianship, and the face they preserved mattered more than the strength of the hand that wore the crown. Even the art surrounding these portraits hints at hidden meanings. Backgrounds often depicted celestial motifs, tapestries of stars, or allegories of eternity. Symbols repeated: globes, crucifixes, suns that never set, as though reminding the viewer that the dynasty's power lay not in armies, but in continuity. To the untrained eye, they were mere decorations. To the initiated, they may have been confirmations, visual affirmations that the dynasty had preserved the face, the name, the blood, and thus fulfilled its sacred role. Could it be that the portraits themselves were more than records, functioning as ritual objects, extensions of the covenant painted onto canvas? In Vienna's Kunsthistorisches Museum, the line of faces stretches unbroken, each painting staring out with uncanny resemblance. Walking past them is to feel watched, as though the eyes follow, their gaze unyielding. Historians describe this as artistry. But what if it is something else? An effect intended, a reminder that the dynasty's presence endures even after their crowns have tarnished. The faces linger, demanding recognition, as though they were designed to haunt the memory of those who dared to forget. Folklore adds further layers. In some regions, villagers claim that the dynasty's features carried power, that to gaze upon their portraits was to risk being marked. Stories tell of travelers who dreamed of the same face after visiting royal galleries, or of bells tolling when portraits were moved from one hall to another. Were these superstitions or echoes of a truth hidden beneath paint and canvas? Perhaps the portraits were more than art. They were vessels anchoring the dynasty's essence across time, ensuring that even when flesh decayed, the face endured. Even in decline, the repetition of features persisted. Heirs weakened, kingdoms fractured, yet the face remained, as though it resisted change. Why would a dynasty risk collapse just to preserve resemblance unless resemblance itself was the mission, the visible continuity of an invisible essence? If so, then their empire was never about land, but about embodiment. A single eternal face surviving in flesh, preserved like a relic, carried forward through blood, no matter the cost. The paradox lingers in the silence of these galleries. We see weakness, deformity, decline. Yet perhaps what we call weakness was, to them, devotion. Perhaps every jutting jaw, every repeated name, every mirrored face was affirmation that the covenant held, that their lineage remained intact. Could it be that their portraits were not merely records of rulers, but icons of guardianship, silent reminders that their role was less to rule than to preserve? And so the faces remain, staring through centuries, mirrors of one another, mirrors of something we cannot name. What if the dynasty's true legacy is not empire or power, but this eternal visage, a face preserved like an unbroken chant, haunting history with the suggestion that time itself was compelled to yield to a bloodline bound by vow? Night falls over Prague, and within its labyrinth of cobbled streets rises the silhouette of Křivoklát Castle, a citadel that once pulsed with strange experiments and whispered prayers. Under Rudolf II, the court became something more than a palace. It became an alchemical furnace, a crucible where religion, science, and secrecy melted into one. Chroniclers tell of workshops filled with furnaces glowing like altars, of scholars hunched over retorts and crucibles, of diagrams sprawled across parchment depicting planets, angels, and geometries that blurred the boundary between cosmos and scripture. To outsiders, this was eccentricity, even madness. Yet to those who saw deeper, Prague had become the stage for something older, a quest for immortality hidden behind the mask of curiosity. Rudolf II gathered alchemists from every corner of Europe, summoning John Dee, Edward Kelly, and countless others whose reputations danced between mystic and charlatan. He amassed relics, manuscripts, and instruments, creating a collection unrivaled in its strangeness. Some claimed he sought the philosopher's stone, the key to turning base metals into gold, but others whispered that his search was never truly about wealth. It was about life itself, prolonging it, preserving it, bending time to obey blood. Was the dynasty's obsession with purity of lineage not also a reflection of this deeper quest? An attempt to create continuity that transcended decay? Perhaps alchemy was not an eccentric diversion, but ritual necessity, another arm of the covenant binding the dynasty to its hidden mission. The court of Prague became known as the Northern Athens. But its pursuits were nothing like Greece's openness. These experiments were shrouded in secrecy, attended by priests as often as scholars, performed in chambers whose windows were shuttered even in daylight. Strange vapors filled the air, tinctures glowed under candlelight, and symbols traced in chalk lingered on floors long after the experiments ended. Visitors reported hearing chants that mixed Latin with languages unknown, voices rising in tones that sounded like both prayers and incantations. Was this science, religion, or something that blurred both? Legends of Rudolph's Cabinet of Curiosities linger even now. Within it were said to be fragments of meteorites, bones of saints, relics from Jerusalem, and objects of unknown origin brought by Jesuit missions from faraway lands. Some spoke of a crystal skull. Others of manuscripts written in undecipherable codes, the famed Voynich manuscript among them. These artifacts were more than curiosities. They were puzzle pieces of knowledge fragmented across time, gathered into one vault under a dynasty chosen to guard them. Could Rudolph's obsession have been less personal eccentricity and more continuation of a hidden mission, preserving fragments of a memory deliberately erased elsewhere? Even the architecture of Prague began to reflect this alchemical vision. The astronomical clock, already ancient, gained new interpretations as scholars aligned its movements with experiments in the castle. Churches built under Habsburg patronage incorporated geometric patterns that mirrored diagrams found in alchemical texts. Was the city itself being reshaped into a laboratory, a living manuscript where stone and star conspired to preserve knowledge in silence? If so, then Prague under Rudolf was not merely a capital, but a vault, a place where forbidden sciences were encoded into the very fabric of streets and walls. The paradox emerges when we consider the Church's stance. Officially, alchemy was tolerated only as natural philosophy and occult pursuits were condemned. Yet the Vatican allowed Rudolph's experiments, even supplying Jesuits who observed and reported. Why, unless these pursuits served a purpose, ensuring continuity of knowledge within safe hands? Perhaps Rudolph was not rebelling against the Church, but fulfilling its unspoken orders, translating fragments of ancient lore into forms that could be preserved. Could his obsession have been less madness than guardianship, less eccentricity than obedience to a script older than his empire? The people of Prague whispered of nights when strange lights glowed from castle windows, colors unnatural, as though the heavens themselves bent toward the city. Some claimed to see figures cloaked in light walking through courtyards. Others spoke of bells ringing without hands, of shadows that lingered when their owners moved away. Folklore painted Rudolph as a sorcerer king. Yet perhaps this folklore was simply the memory of rituals never explained. What if these lights and sounds were not hallucinations, but echoes of experiments blending relic, prayer, and alchemical fire, seeking the threshold between mortal and eternal? Rudolph's decline mirrored his obsessions. He became reclusive, his health frail, his empire unstable. Yet he clung to his manuscripts, refusing to part with them, even as enemies closed in. When he died, many of these treasures vanished, spirited away into monasteries and libraries under imperial and Vatican seal. Where are they now? Some believe fragments survive in Austria, others in the Vatican Library, others scattered into private collections. Their survival suggests design, as though even his failure was part of a larger continuity. Could it be that his court was never meant to succeed in transmutation, but to preserve fragments for future generations? Hidden under the mask of failure, the alchemical Knight of Prague remains a paradox. Was Rudolf II a mad emperor chasing illusions? Or was he the last sovereign openly performing the dynasty's true mission, preserving and protecting knowledge that ordinary history sought to erase? The silence of the vaults answers with neither affirmation nor denial. What survives are the whispers of strange lights, undecipherable manuscripts, and faces in portraits that seem haunted by something more than power. And so the question lingers like smoke rising from an extinguished furnace. Was the dynasty's pursuit of alchemy a diversion, or was it the visible surface of a hidden flame? A flame carried from Templar vaults, preserved in Jesuit ciphers, and guarded in Prague's night until the world was ready, or never ready, to see it. The 30 Years' War is remembered as one of Europe's darkest convulsions, a storm of blood and fire that consumed the 17th century. Official histories call it a religious conflict, Catholics against Protestants, but its scale and ferocity exceed the logic of theology. Entire regions were reduced to ash, populations starved, villages emptied, and chronicles estimate that a third of Central Europe's people vanished. Yet, behind the smoke and ruin lies a deeper paradox. If the Habsburgs were defenders of faith, why did their realm bleed so completely? Could the war have been less about religion and more about the reshaping of memory, a deliberate unweaving of Europe's past to conceal what should never have survived at its core? The Habsburg dynasty fought to preserve Catholic order. Yet again and again, their campaigns dragged on, prolonged beyond strategic reason, as though the goal was not victory, but destruction. Cities burned not for conquest, but for erasure. Manuscripts vanished in flames, abbeys looted and emptied, archives reduced to smoke. Was this collateral damage or the silent aim of the conflict itself, to rewrite history by obliterating inconvenient memory? If so, then the war was not only political, but archival, fought as much in libraries as on battlefields. The Battle of White Mountain in 1620 marked the war's early pivot. A Protestant rebellion in Bohemia was crushed. Yet in the aftermath, the victors did not merely suppress opponents, they confiscated entire libraries, seizing manuscripts from nobles and scholars, shipping them to Vienna and Rome. Some were burned, but many were hidden, locked away, where they would never again shape public thought. The pattern repeats. Wars framed as battles of faith become cover for the systematic silencing of memory. Could it be that the Habsburgs fought not to expand their empire, but to secure guardianship of knowledge that might otherwise have escaped their grasp? The destruction of Magdeburg in 1631 reveals the same paradox. Accounts describe fire consuming nearly the entire city, tens of thousands slaughtered, streets running with blood. Yet among the details lies a quieter note. The cathedral's treasury was emptied before the city fell, its contents carried away under guard. Where did those objects go? Who ensured their removal? If the sacking of Magdeburg was as chaotic as chroniclers describe, how could relics and manuscripts have been preserved so neatly, unless chaos itself was the disguise, destruction the mask behind which selective preservation occurred? Jesuit records, when deciphered, hint at coded messages describing cargo secured during campaigns. The words are vague, but the implication is chilling. Armies moved not only for land, but for objects, manuscripts, relics, fragments of forbidden lore hidden in abbeys and towns. Soldiers may have believed they fought for faith, but commanders carried sealed orders. What if these campaigns were less wars of religion than missions of collection, harvesting fragments of knowledge scattered across Europe, gathering them into Habsburg hands under the guise of holy war? The war's longevity itself raises suspicion. 30 years of devastation exhausted empires, drained treasuries, and fractured societies. Yet the dynasty persisted. Why continue such a ruinous struggle unless its purpose was never territorial at all? Perhaps the length was necessary to erase fully, to overwrite memory with silence, to ensure that entire generations were born into a world cleansed of earlier knowledge. In this light, the war becomes less absurd and more purposeful, a slow ritual of destruction that left Europe both scarred and malleable, its story rewritten in blood. In Prague, legends tell of wagons leaving the city under guard at night, filled with crates of manuscripts taken from libraries. Locals whispered they were bound not for Vienna, but for monasteries deep in the Alps, hidden where no army could follow. Some spoke of books written in unknown alphabets, of diagrams resembling stars and machines, of chronicles describing civilizations that never appeared in official history. If true, then the war did not merely erase. It also preserved, and fragments of erased memory survived in the most secret vaults, sealed under dynastic and papal protection. The paradox is inescapable. If the Habsburgs were defenders of Christendom, why did Christendom itself emerge so fractured, so diminished, so haunted by silence after the war? Perhaps because the purpose was never unity, but division, never preservation, but erasure. By reshaping Europe's memory, the dynasty fulfilled its hidden duty, ensuring that forbidden threads were cut, dangerous stories destroyed, and only fragments preserved under guardianship. Could it be that the 30 Years' War was less a war of faith than a ritual of forgetting? A firestorm designed to cleanse history itself. When the Peace of Westphalia ended the conflict in 1648, Europe emerged altered. Nations were redrawn, power decentralized, the Holy Roman Empire weakened. To historians, it was the end of medieval Christendom, the birth of modern sovereignty. But in the shadows, what was truly achieved? Libraries burned, manuscripts vanished, relics hidden, entire populations silenced. What if Westphalia was not peace, but the closing of a vault, the sealing of a rewritten world? Perhaps the war's true purpose was completed not on the battlefield, but in the silence afterward, when no one remembered what had been lost. The devastation left scars, but silence leaves deeper wounds. Today, when we read of the war, we see numbers, treaties, and generals. Yet beneath the statistics lies the possibility of something older erased, something that slipped from memory under the cover of chaos. Was the 30 Years' War truly Europe's great religious tragedy, or was it the dynasty's greatest achievement in secrecy, the reshaping of memory itself, so complete that even now we struggle to recall what was erased? On a quiet bend of the Danube rises Melk Abbey, its Baroque towers gleaming above the river like guardians of eternity. Tourists today marvel at frescoes and libraries, yet few consider the silence beneath the vaults, hidden deep in the stone where monks have kept watch for centuries. The Abbey's library is celebrated for its beauty, but behind gilded doors and painted ceilings, legends speak of another chamber, closed to all but the initiated, where manuscripts lie sealed in darkness. Could this be one of the dynasty's deepest vaults? A repository of fragments gathered through centuries of war and covenant, guarded not by armies but by monks bound to silence. Melk's reputation for secrecy stretches back to the Middle Ages. Pilgrims spoke of monks carrying chests into the abbey at night, their contents unknown, their locks never opened in public. Some whispered that these chests came from Vienna, others from Prague, and still others from lands beyond the Alps. Were these simply treasures of piety, or were they fragments of knowledge seized during the 30 Years' War? Manuscripts confiscated from nobles and scholars, hidden where no rebellion could reclaim them? If so, then Melk preserved not religion alone, but memory. Memory deliberately erased from the wider world, yet safeguarded in silence beneath its towers. The library above is vast, lined with thousands of volumes, their spines gilded in gold, their arrangement a harmony of order. Yet travelers long noticed that certain shelves were sealed, certain cabinets never opened, their keys held only by abbots sworn to secrecy. Catalogs omit titles, and when questioned, monks speak only of forbidden texts, locked away for the protection of souls. What makes a book so dangerous that it cannot even be named? Could these be fragments of the same knowledge once carried by Templars, whispered in alchemical courts, preserved in Jesuit cipher? The thought lingers like incense in the silent halls. Legends in the surrounding villages tell of manuscripts describing civilizations erased by flood, chronicles of lands across the ocean long before Columbus, diagrams of machines that seemed impossible in their time. To the villagers, these were fantasies. Yet, why do such stories persist century after century, always tied to Melk's vaults, always repeating the same themes of forbidden knowledge locked in stone? Folklore may distort, but it rarely invents without seed. Perhaps the Abbey's silence conceals truths too vast for daylight, truths that could fracture the story of Europe if ever revealed. The paradox sharpens when we recall the dynasty's devotion to the Church. The Habsburgs gave Melk their patronage, endowing it with lands, wealth, and protection. Why such loyalty to one abbey among many, unless it was more than an abbey? It was a vault, a safe house for the covenant binding the dynasty and the Vatican. If relics and manuscripts flowed into Melk's vaults, then the dynasty ensured their guardianship not through soldiers, but through monks whose vows bound them more tightly than chains. Could Melk have been chosen precisely because its silence was unbreakable, its isolation perfect for secrets never meant to be known? Even the architecture hints at hidden design. Beneath the library lies a series of chambers arranged with curious precision, their proportions echoing sacred geometry. Some researchers note alignments with celestial events, solstices, and equinoxes reflected in shafts of light that pierce the halls only on certain days. Were these mere accidents of design or coded affirmations that the abbey itself was a vessel of hidden knowledge, its stones arranged not only for devotion, but for preservation? To step into its corridors is to feel a weight that art cannot explain, a silence heavier than prayer. In the 18th century, when Enlightenment reforms swept Europe and many monasteries were suppressed, Melk endured. Its vaults were never opened, its manuscripts never seized. How did it escape scrutiny when so many others fell? Perhaps because its treasures were protected not only by monks, but by the dynasty itself, ensuring that the abbey remained untouchable. If so, then the silence surrounding its vaults was preserved deliberately, its secrets carried forward into the modern age without disturbance. Could this continuity be coincidence? Or does it reveal the persistence of a covenant too powerful to be broken even today? Scholars admire Melk's illuminated manuscripts, its ornate bindings, its artistry, yet even they admit that gaps remain in its catalog, volumes rumored but never seen. Some claim entire collections are missing from record, hidden away in sections no visitor may enter. Why maintain such secrecy in an age that prides itself on openness, unless the knowledge contained within those books is still considered too dangerous, too destabilizing, too forbidden? Could it be that the dynasty's guardianship continues not through emperors and armies, but through monks who remain silent, preserving fragments of a memory humanity is not yet permitted to reclaim? The silence of Melk is profound. Visitors leave enchanted by its beauty, unaware that beneath the frescoes and gilded halls may lie manuscripts capable of altering the foundations of history. The monks smile, the bells toll, the river flows on, carrying centuries of secrets hidden behind stone. What if the abbey is not merely a place of devotion, but one of the last vaults of a covenant that shaped Europe's destiny? What if its silence is not absence, but guardianship, the final echo of a dynasty that once ruled an empire where the sun never set, yet whose true light remains locked in darkness? The fall of the Habsburgs is often told as a slow decline, a crumbling under the weight of wars, debts, and revolutions. Yet a closer examination of the fragment suggests the collapse was less decay and more design, as though the dynasty did not simply fail, but was allowed to fade, fulfilling a role that could not continue into the modern age. Could it be that their empire was never intended to last forever, but only as long as necessary to safeguard what they had been entrusted with? By the 18th century, the dynasty's power had begun to fracture. The Spanish branch ended with Charles II, leaving the Bourbon line to inherit its crown. The Austrian branch endured longer, but even it grew fragile, its influence challenged by rising nation-states. Yet throughout their decline, one constant remained: the secrecy surrounding their vaults, libraries, and relics. Even as their lands slipped away, their guardianship seemed intact. Perhaps this was their true task, and once completed, the dynasty itself could wither. What if their fall was not tragedy, but conclusion, the closing of a chapter written long before? Maria Theresa, the last of the Habsburgs in name, struggled to maintain the dynasty's vast dominion. She reformed armies, reshaped bureaucracy, and sought to preserve the empire against the tide of modernity. Yet behind her political efforts, whispers persisted of a queen who spent long hours in chapels, poring over manuscripts in the Hofburg's sealed cabinets. Was she a reformer, or was she the final guardian, ensuring that whatever had been preserved for centuries remained intact as her line transformed into the Habsburg Lorraine? Could her reforms have been distractions, while her true labor was the silent continuation of the covenant her ancestors had carried? Even more telling is the dynasty's role in the 19th century. As revolutions swept Europe, demanding freedom and nationhood, the Habsburgs clung to symbols older than politics. They paraded relics, invoked faith, and staged rituals that seemed less about governance than about continuity. Their power waned, yet they still held on to what mattered most. Their vaults remained sealed, their secrets preserved. Why maintain silence when their empire itself was collapsing, unless that silence was their final duty, more vital than crowns or thrones? The First World War delivered the final blow. Franz Joseph reigned for decades, yet his empire grew brittle, fractured by nationalism and strained by modernity. His nephew, Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination sparked the war, became a symbol of the dynasty's vulnerability. Yet even his death carries strange echoes. Reports suggest he maintained private archives at Konopište Castle, filled with manuscripts and artifacts gathered from across Europe. After his death, these archives vanished into obscurity, many removed under orders that remain untraceable. Could this have been the true inheritance he died protecting, less his throne than his vault? By 1918, the Habsburg monarchy dissolved, its empire dismembered by victors who sought to erase its legacy. Yet the silence endured. Vaults remained sealed. Abbas preserved their manuscripts, and the Vatican's archives grew ever larger. If the dynasty had merely failed, why did their secrecy survive untouched? Perhaps their guardianship had been transferred, their duty completed, their role no longer necessary. The empire fell, but the covenant endured, shifting into other unseen hands. The paradox is unsettling. How could a dynasty that ruled half the world for centuries vanish so quickly? Its lands dissolved into republics, its crowns abandoned. Unless the empire itself was always secondary, a vessel created to serve a hidden purpose. Once that purpose was fulfilled, the vessel was discarded, its pieces scattered. What looks like collapse may instead be completion, the quiet ending of a dynasty that had served its role too faithfully for too long. Legends even claim that the last emperor, Charles I, carried a sealed packet into exile after the war, refusing to part with it until his death. No one knows its contents, whether a relic, a manuscript, or simply a symbol of continuity, but it suggests the dynasty's last act was not surrender, but guardianship, carrying into exile the remnants of a covenant too dangerous to leave behind. Today, the Habsburgs survive as private individuals. Their crowns rest in museums, their palaces open to tourists, yet the silence lingers. Vaults remain locked, manuscripts uncatalogued, relics hidden from public view. Perhaps the dynasty did not truly vanish at all. Perhaps their role continues quietly, stripped of thrones but not of guardianship, their bloodlines still carrying the memory of secrets older than empires. Could it be that their public fall was merely a disguise, a way to preserve the covenant in a world too modern to accept it openly? The dynasty's fall thus appears less like failure and more like concealment. They vanished as rulers, but their silence endured, heavier than crowns, older than empires. And so the question lingers like a shadow across the ruins of their empire. Did the Habsburgs truly fall, or did they simply close the door, leaving us with the illusion of an ending while their real legacy remains hidden, sealed in vaults we may never see? After the crowns were laid down and the empire dissolved, one might expect the Habsburgs to vanish into obscurity, remembered only in portraits and textbooks. Yet, even without thrones, their bloodline endures, their presence lingering in Europe's veins like a faint but unbroken current. They no longer rule palaces or command armies, yet whispers suggest their role may not have ended with abdication. Perhaps their crowns were only masks, and the true guardianship, the covenant passed through centuries, remains alive in silence, carried quietly by descendants who still walk among us. The modern Habsburgs live as private individuals, yet their lineage continues to attract fascination. They hold no official power, yet their marriages, titles, and alliances remain objects of quiet attention. Why does the world still watch as if expecting something? Could it be that the dynasty's significance was never about sovereignty, but about continuity, about bloodlines carrying fragments of memory that cannot be erased by politics? The empire may have fallen, but the essence of their guardianship may have slipped seamlessly into the modern age, invisible but intact. Consider how their name appears at strange crossroads of history even after the empire's fall. Archduke Otto von Habsburg, for example, remained an influential figure in European politics during the 20th century, advocating unity and integration. To the public, they were emperors, kings, and queens, yet history records only what was visible. Behind the pageantry and politics lay another layer, a continuum of guardianship that outlasted crowns, armies, and empires. Archduke Otto von Habsburg may have moved through 20th century parliaments and treaties as a statesman, but some whispered that his work echoed a deeper mission, ensuring the dynasty's influence persisted even without crowns. Was this advocacy political idealism or a modern adaptation of an age-old covenant, shaping Europe not through conquest, but through subtler, enduring forms of power? Symbols endure where empires have vanished. The double-headed eagle, once emblazoned on imperial banners, survives in coats of arms, architecture, and insignia across the continent. To most, it is history. To the initiated, perhaps a sign that the covenant of continuity persists, as eternal and unbroken as the faces in Habsburg portraits. Heraldry, like these canvases, may preserve the dynasty's sacred mission in plain sight, visible only to those who know where to look. Legends suggest that descendants of the Habsburgs still guard vaults in Austria, Spain, and Switzerland. Their contents remain undisclosed, and the Vatican maintains its silence, archives as impenetrable as ever. Rumors insist the bloodline still carries keys, literal or symbolic, to secrets older than kingdoms themselves. Guardianship may have shifted from emperors to private heirs who no longer wield armies, yet still bear the weight of silence. Their exile, then, was not the end of a role, but a deliberate concealment, protecting the covenant from a world unready to see it. The paradox grows sharper when we consider how the dynasty's decline coincided with the rise of nations, science, and transparency, an age intolerant of relics, mysticism, or covenants sealed in silence. Yet the bloodline endured. Perhaps the fall was not failure but adaptation, secrecy transformed, guardianship preserved through disguise, continuity maintained in ordinary lives. Disappearance may have been survival in plain sight. Folklore preserves this memory. In villages once under Habsburg rule, elders tell of treasures hidden in mountains, manuscripts preserved in monasteries, relics carried into exile. These tales persist because the silence remains unbroken. Where no answers exist, myth carries fragments of truth. Perhaps the modern Habsburgs remain bound by oath, their survival dependent on loyalty to a covenant older than nations. Even in the 20th century, strange echoes appeared. Palaces and abbeys associated with the dynasty were targeted during both world wars, yet many archives emerged intact. Was this luck or protection? Perhaps the same hidden hand that safeguarded them across centuries continued to ensure the dynasty's guardianship even in modern chaos. Today, their descendants walk among us as private citizens, politicians, writers, or historians. Yet beneath the surface, one must wonder, do they still guard fragments of memory, whisper of vaults, relics, manuscripts, or oaths too ancient to abandon? Could their legacy have never been empire, but the guardianship of silence, a sacred inheritance passed shadow-like from generation to generation? The paradox persists into the present. The Habsburgs, who once ruled an empire where the sun never set, now live quietly. Their names endure, their bloodline survives, and their silence remains intact. Was their fall an ending, or the perfect concealment, a transformation of public power into private guardianship? Perhaps the Habsburgs never truly disappeared, but continue their mission, hidden from view. Their faces no longer painted in gilded portraits, yet still marked by the weight of secrets carried in silence. History remembers the Habsburgs as rulers, but the covenant they bore may outlast even the empires they commanded. Their names are etched into treaties, their portraits fill galleries, and their palaces still tower over Europe's cities. Yet when one gathers the fragments, the paradox becomes impossible to ignore. Their public story is one of crowns and power, but their hidden story whispers of guardianship, of relics preserved, manuscripts locked away, and secrets passed from generation to generation under the seal of silence. Could it be that their empire was never truly about ruling bodies, but about preserving memory? Fragments of knowledge deemed too dangerous to leave in the open. The pattern repeats endlessly. Wars fought not only for territory, but for archives. Marriages arranged not only for politics, but for continuity of blood. Vaults filled not with gold, but with manuscripts and relics, too sacred or too forbidden for daylight. From Vienna to Madrid, from Melk Abbey to the Escorial, from Jesuit ciphers to Templar shadows, the dynasty appears less like a family of rulers and more like a brotherhood of custodians. The question that remains is not whether they ruled well or poorly, but what exactly they were protecting and for whom. Consider how consistently their story circles back to silence. Their portraits reveal continuity of face, yet conceal individuality. Their libraries dazzle with gilded bindings, yet hide shelves sealed from view. Their alliances produced empires, yet ended in a decline that feels more deliberate than accidental. Silence follows them like a shadow. Why preserve knowledge only to hide it unless their role was never to reveal but to contain, to guard memory as one guards fire, dangerous if released, vital if preserved? Perhaps the world we know was shaped not by what they revealed, but by what they concealed. The Vatican's presence at every turning point strengthens this suspicion. From coronations to confessions, from marriages to wars, the Church's hand guided the dynasty, shaping its destiny as both throne and vault. If the Habsburgs were guardians, then the Vatican was the architect, ensuring that the bloodline carried its burden faithfully. But what was that burden? Was it fragments of ancient civilizations erased by flood and fire? The legacy of the Templars, suppressed yet never destroyed? A covenant stretching back even further, binding rulers to protect knowledge of humanity's forgotten beginnings? The questions linger unanswered, unresolved. Even their fall seems paradoxical. The empire dissolved, the crowns abandoned, the dynasty reduced to private lives. Yet their silence endured. Vaults remained locked, manuscripts never catalogued, relics never revealed. If their role had been merely imperial, their collapse would have ended their significance. But the guardianship appears to have continued, stripped of crowns, yet still carried forward in blood. Perhaps this was the final transformation, the concealment of a covenant too obvious in imperial form, safer now in private silence. Could the Habsburgs today still carry fragments of memory in their veins? Even as their palaces turn into museums, the dynasty becomes a mirror of the very history it shaped. Visible grandeur conceals invisible truth. We are shown the pageantry of empire, the spectacle of wars, the decay of bloodlines. Yet behind these images lingers another story, one that history refuses to speak aloud. Were the Habsburgs merely rulers, or were they wardens of a truth too vast to be revealed, custodians of humanity's hidden memory, sealed in stone, parchment, and blood? And if so, what becomes of that memory now? In an age that claims to value transparency yet still leaves vaults unopened, the silence surrounding their legacy remains the most eloquent testimony. It whispers through the locked doors of libraries, the sealed chambers of abbeys, the portraits that repeat the same face endlessly as if time itself had been trapped. It whispers in the unanswered questions of wars that destroyed archives, fleets that carried strange cargo, and marriages that repeated endlessly until faces blurred. Silence is their inheritance, and silence is their bequest. What if their empire was never about glory, but about ensuring that certain truths remained hidden long enough to preserve the order of the world? The question that lingers now is simple but unsettling. If the Habsburgs were guardians, then guardians of what? And if their role was to preserve secrets until humanity was ready or never ready, what does it mean that their blood still flows? Their silence still holds. Their vaults remain sealed. Perhaps the true empire of the Habsburgs was never one of land, but one of memory, an invisible dominion stretching across centuries, guarding knowledge erased yet never destroyed. The story fades not with answers, but with echoes, as though we have wandered through long corridors only to find ourselves once more before locked doors. The Habsburg dynasty, remembered in marble and gold, dissolves in shadow when examined closely. Their crowns glittered, yet they were heavy with obligations. Their armies marched, yet their greatest battles were fought in silence. Their palaces soared, yet their true empire lay in vaults, in manuscripts, in whispers preserved beneath stone. We imagine history as a straight path, yet their legacy suggests otherwise. Perhaps history is less a record of what happened and more a tapestry woven to conceal what must not be spoken. If so, then the Habsburgs were its weavers, chosen to preserve memory not for us, but from us, ensuring that certain truths survived only in silence. The dynasty fell, yet their guardianship may continue still, carried quietly in bloodlines, in sealed abbeys, in symbols that linger like ghosts upon Europe's stones. Tonight, the echoes of their silence remain with us, the flicker of candlelight upon gilded portraits, the hollow corridors of palaces where footsteps fade, the closed cabinets of libraries that promise secrets yet never open. Perhaps the dynasty's true gift is not what it revealed, but what it concealed, leaving us with questions that unsettle, doubts that linger, suspicions that refuse to sleep. And so we leave their story not with certainty, but with wonder, standing before a locked vault whose key may never be found. The Habsburgs ruled an empire where the sun never set, but their true empire lies in shadows, where silence speaks louder than words, and where the questions themselves are the only inheritance we are permitted to hold.